You love capitalism. Really, you do. And you can't stand big government. Really, you can't. Don't believe me? Then I'll just have to prove it to you. Do you use an iPhone, Android, MacBook, PC? Read on a Kindle? Watch TV and movies on Netflix? Videos on YouTube? Shop on Amazon? Listen to Spotify? Search on Google? Send money on Venmo? Grab a ride with Uber? Drive with Waze? Book a room with Airbnb? Are you on Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat? You probably use many, if not all of these things. And if you're like me, you love them. In today's world, they're practically necessities. Where do you think they came from? From entrepreneurs with great ideas and the freedom to test them in the marketplace. That is what is known as capitalism. Now consider some other things you probably use. Have you been to the DMV? Gone through airport security? Mailed a package at the post office? Called the IRS customer service line? Or called any government office for that matter? What's different? Why is going to the Apple Store so fun, but going to the DMV so painful? Because one has nothing to do with government, and one is the government. One needs to satisfy its customers to survive and grow. One doesn't. The purpose of government is not to create products, and we don't expect it to. But if you thought about it for a few moments, you'd realize you don't want the government involved in just about anything private business can do. That's because profit-motivated individuals have to work to please their customers. You, government agencies, don't have to please anyone. Call that IRS service line if you doubt me. Can you imagine if Steve Jobs had to seek government approval for every new design of the iPhone? We'd have been lucky to get to the iPhone 3G. Look at Uber. Just a few years ago, summoning a private driver in a few minutes who would take you where you wanted to go was truly a service available only to the wealthiest people. But now, thanks to capitalism, private rides are an affordable option for ordinary people all over the world. Until Uber came around, if it started to rain in, say, Manhattan, and you wanted to grab a cab, good luck. Too many rain-drenched people and too few cabs. Uber had a better idea. Rain falls, demand for rides spikes. Raise prices to incentivize more Uber drivers to hit the road. Ride in the rain problem solved. Airbnb is another example. Only a few years ago, if you were going on vacation with your friends or family, hotels were just about your only option. But hotels are expensive and often don't provide all that much in terms of space, amenities, or interesting neighborhoods. If you wanted to, say, find out if individual homeowners were making their homes or apartments available for a few nights, you'd have to scour internet postings. But then Airbnb came along, giving anyone with a computer or smartphone access to over 2 million homes in 190 countries. You can find places with hot tubs and pools, or if you're on a tighter budget, you can rent a room, or even just a couch. Government never could have done this. What motivation would it have? How would it even know we wanted services like Uber or Airbnb? We didn't know it until risk-taking entrepreneurs made it possible. Thanks to capitalism. And no thanks to government, which more often than not just gets in the way. Why? Because the government's knee-jerk reaction is to regulate and control everything it can regulate and control. Otherwise, what would be the purpose of many government agencies and all those bureaucrats? Cities across the world are putting up barriers to slow down or shut down services like Uber and Airbnb. Rulemaking may be the only area where the government shows creativity. Economic growth has the best chance of happening in the absence of that rulemaking. As economist Adam Thayer explains, the internet, to use just one important example, was able to develop in a regulatory climate that embraced what he calls permissionless innovation. This approach to regulating allows entrepreneurs to meet their customers' needs without first seeking government approval. In sum, almost everything you enjoy using is a product of capitalism. Almost everything you can't stand is a product of big government. So do you love capitalism? Of course you do. You practice it every day. It's time to preach it. I'm Jared Meyer of the Manhattan Institute for Prager University.
The world is on fire. The Middle East is being torn up by war and terrorism that have forced millions of people to flee, Syria looks like the disaster of a generation. Iran seeks to dominate the region and openly declares its intention to wipe a sovereign nation off the map, while in Eastern Europe, a resurgent Russia has seized Ukrainian territory by force of arms. China is flexing its muscles against its neighbors around the South China Sea. There is only one nation in the world capable of putting out these fires. That nation is, of course, the United States. Many Americans will argue, understandably, that this is not fair. It may not be fair, but it is a fact. Only America has the diplomatic reach, the financial resources, and the firepower to lead the free world against the autocrats, rogue states, and terrorists that are trying to overwhelm it. As the Prime Minister of Denmark from 2001 to 2009, and the Secretary General of NATO from 2009 to 2014, I know how important American leadership is. I've seen firsthand what happens when America tries to lead from behind instead of leading from the front. A case in point, Russia illegally annexed Crimea in March 2014, the first gunpoint land grab in Europe since the end of World War II. US Secretary of State John Kerry called it an unbelievable act of aggression. He went on, "You just don't, in the 21st century, behave in 19th century fashion by invading another country on a completely trumped up pretext." This might be an admirable statement of principle, but as a guide to policy, it is dangerously naive, because whether it was believable or not, it happened. The first half of the 20th century was the bloodiest in human history. That was before America became a global superpower. Since America's ascendancy, the major world powers have coexisted in relative peace. Now that peace is threatened, and America must step forward again. Simply put, no one else can do it. Europe is too weak and divided to lead the world. The free nations have an essential role to play, and they must shoulder their full share at the cost. But only America has the credibility to lead. This is not just about money or manpower. It's also about morality. Only America has the moral greatness to lead the free world, not for the sake of power, but for the sake of peace. Yet the US will only be able to ensure peace if its leaders act with conviction. If the world even thinks that America lacks the will to use force or enforce its red lines, it leaves a vacuum that will be filled by corrupt autocrats, rogue states, and murderous terrorists. As tempting as retreat might be, it won't make America and the other freedom-loving countries safer or more prosperous. History shows us the bad guys don't stay in their own neighborhoods. We only need to look at Pearl Harbor or 9/11 to be reminded that the safety of Americans is deeply connected to the rest of the world. And the stability that has permitted the vast and worldwide economic expansion since World War II, an expansion that has lifted billions of people out of poverty, could not have happened if America had not guaranteed it. But freedom, stability, and prosperity don't come for free. And they are not the norm, they are the exception. An American retreat will unleash a new plague of dictators and oppressors who seek to undo all the good America has done to secure peace and prosperity around the world for decades. And that could lead to a fire no one will be able to put out. I'm Anders Fogh Rasmussen for Prager University.
Does an American citizen have a constitutional right to own a gun? Here's what the Second Amendment says. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. Now, it once seemed to me like that language only protected state militias and not individuals. Indeed, this is the view held by the 4 dissenting Supreme Court justices in the 2008 case of District of Columbia versus Heller, a landmark case dealing with gun ownership. But the more research I did, the more I came to realize that my initial view was mistaken, and that the founders were in fact securing an individual right. The 5 justices who voted to affirm the right to own a gun in D.C. versus Heller had indeed made the correct decision. Let's look at the amendment one more time. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. We first need to focus on the phrase, the right of the people. Note that the people are the only ones whose right is secured here, not the militia or a state government. This phrase, the right of the people, comes up a few times in the Constitution. For example, the First Amendment refers to the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government. And the Fourth Amendment secures the right of the people to be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures. Why then, if the authors of the Constitution felt so strongly about the right of the people to own guns, did they include language about a well-regulated militia? These opening words of the amendment might be called a justification clause. Such clauses are used to help explain why a right is being secured. But it's the operative clause that explains what right is being secured. In this case, the right of the people to keep and bear arms. And what was the word militia understood to mean at the time? Well, the Militia Act of 1792 defined militia to mean all white males 18 to 45. Today, of course, militia would include women and people of all races, but it was clearly not a reference to a small National Guard-type group. And what about the part of the amendment that says a militia is necessary to the security of a free state? What the opponents of personal gun ownership ask, does a personal right of gun ownership have to do with that? Again, historical context is key. In the 1790s, the phrase free state wasn't used to mean an individual state like New York or Rhode Island. Rather, it meant what we'd call today a free country, a nation free of despotism. A free state is what the framers wanted America to be. They saw an armed citizenry as in part a hedge against tyranny. Citizens who own weapons can protect themselves, prevent tyrants from seizing power, and protect the nation from foreign enemies. This does not mean, though, that this right is unlimited. Free speech, for example, has long been subject to some narrow and reasonable regulations. But severe restrictions on owning a gun, like severe restrictions on free speech, would violate the Second Amendment as the founders understood it. Maybe you think this understanding of the Second Amendment is outdated today, that the Constitution needs to change as public attitudes change. The founders included a provision for doing just that. If the public attitude really has changed, the Constitution can be amended to reflect that change. But ironically, even if we focus on current public attitudes, the case for individual gun ownership is as strong as ever. Polls consistently show that over 2/3 of Americans believe that the Second Amendment secures the right of citizens to own a gun. And Congress and state governments have repeatedly reaffirmed this view, including in recent decades. So, does the Second Amendment secure an individual right to bear arms? It did when it was written, it has throughout American history, and it does today. I'm Eugene Volokh, professor of law at UCLA for Prager University.
If for the same work women only make 77 cents for every dollar a man makes, why don't businesses hire only women? Wages are the biggest expense for most businesses, so hiring only women would reduce costs by nearly a quarter, and that would go right to the bottom line. Don't businesses want to be profitable? Or are they really just bad at math? Well, actually, It's the feminists, celebrities, and politicians spreading this wage gap myth who have the math problem. Here's why. The 77 cents on the dollar statistic is calculated by dividing the median earnings of all women working full-time by the median earnings of all men working full-time. In other words, if the average income of all men is, say, $40,000 a year, and the average annual income of all women is, say, $30,800, that would mean that women earn 77 cents for every dollar a man earns. 30,800 divided by 40,000 equals 0.77. But these calculations don't reveal a gender wage injustice because they don't take into account occupation, position, education, or hours worked per week. Even a study by the American Association of University Women, a feminist organization, shows that the actual wage gap shrinks to only 6.6 cents when you factor in different choices men and women make. And the key word here is choice. The small wage gap that does exist has nothing to do with paying women less, let alone with sexism. It has to do with differences in individual career choices that men and women make. In 2009, the U.S. Department of Labor released a paper that examined more than 50 peer-reviewed studies and concluded that the oft-cited 23-cent wage gap may be almost entirely the result of individual choices being made by both male and female workers. Well, let's look at some of those choices. Georgetown University compiled a list of the 5 best-paying college majors and the percentage of men and women majoring in those fields. Number 1 best-paying major, petroleum engineering, 87% male. Number 2, pharmaceutical sciences, 48% male. 3, mathematics and computer science, 67% male. 4, aerospace engineering, 88% male. 5, chemical engineering, 72% male. Notice that women outrepresent men in only one of the 5 top-paying majors, by only a few percentage points. Now consider the same study's list of the 5 worst-paying college majors. Number 1, counseling and psychology, 74% female. 2, early childhood education, 97% female. 3, theology and religious vocations, 66% male. 4, human services and community organization, 81% female. And 5, social work, 88% female. Here, it's the women who lead in all but one category. Even within the same profession, men and women make different career choices that impact how much money they make. Take nursing, where male nurses, on the whole, earn 18% more than female nurses. The reason? Male nurses gravitate to the best-paying nursing specialties, they work longer hours, and disproportionately find jobs in cities with the highest compensation. Now here's how one expert on nursing compensation, Professor Linda Aiken of the University of Pennsylvania, sums up the data. Career choices and educational differences explain most, if not all, the gender gap in nursing. The Department of Labor paper concluded that once these differences are accounted for across all professions, the unexplained wage gap is somewhere between 4.8 and 7%, almost identical to the 6.6 percentage gap found by the AAUW. But why is there any gap at all? No one knows for sure, as both the AAUW and the Labor Department concede. There are so many variables that drive wages that no single study can cover them all. Few wage gap studies control for variables such as dangerous work environment. Men are vastly overrepresented, for example, on oil rigs. And here's another variable. Men are more willing and able to work long hours without advance notice. According to Harvard economist Claudia Golden, even if 2 lawyers have the same education, same specialty, and work the same number of hours, firms pay more to someone who is willing to always be on call and ready to be in the office when the firm needs them, as opposed to wanting a more regular schedule. This isn't sexism, it's just common sense. With more realistic categories and definitions, whatever wage gap remains would certainly narrow to the point of vanishing. So it seems that business leaders aren't bad at math simply because they don't only hire women. Those who claim that for the same work, women earn 77 cents on the dollar compared to men, on the other hand, are not merely bad at math, but at telling the truth. I'm Christina Hoff Sommers of the American Enterprise Institute for Prager University.
What's the best way to help poor people escape poverty? Progressives and conservatives have very different answers to this question. But before we explore those answers, let's agree on this. Both progressives and conservatives believe that the government has a moral obligation to help those who, through bad luck or unfortunate circumstances, can't help themselves. Here's what a conservative icon, Nobel Prize-winning economist Friedrich Hayek said on the subject. There is no reason why, in a society that has reached the general level of wealth ours has attained, the first kind of security should not be guaranteed to all. Some minimum of food, shelter, and clothing, sufficient to preserve health and the capacity to work. Whatever the media might tell you, there isn't a conservative out there who would not agree with Hayek's statement. As I've documented in my book, Who Really Cares?, when it comes to philanthropy and charitable giving, conservatives actually outgive progressives by a lot. Where the two sides disagree is on the role the government plays, not in protecting the poor from poverty, but in lifting them out of it. Here's a disturbing piece of data. On balance, since President Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty programs came fully online in 1966, the poverty rate in America has hardly budged. That rate, as computed by the United States government, was 14.7% in 1966. And today, it's 13.5%. The rate has fluctuated a few points up and down over the decades. The net result is just 1 percentage point of progress. And this is after the government has spent over $20 trillion on poverty relief programs. $20 trillion, the current size of the U.S. debt. And the needle has barely moved. Now, it's true that the official poverty rate doesn't measure consumption. Certainly, poor people today have many more things than poor people did in 1970. Across all income levels, including the poor, Americans are likely to have cell phones, air conditioners, flat-screen TVs, computers, and a car. And life expectancy has lengthened considerably thanks to overall improvements in healthcare. But it demeans poor people to say that this material progress makes poverty less of a problem. Our goal should never be to merely make poverty less miserable for people. Our goal must be to make poverty more escapable. Many progressives offer a straightforward solution: more funding for poverty programs. They believe that we need to transfer more wealth through government taxation from people who have money to people who don't. This is the income inequality argument. Conservatives have a different answer: more opportunity. Conservatives define success by how few people need help from the government, not by how many people we can enroll in government programs. When they see 60% more people on food stamps after the recession than we had before it started, conservatives say, that's not success, that's failure. You see, conservatives believe that simply giving people money doesn't help them escape poverty. On the contrary, it can keep them locked into it. Getting things without working for them is a very hard habit to break. So much so that it can become a way of life. According to my research, earning your way out of poverty is much more empowering and enduring than being supported by a variety of government programs which do little more than maintain people in their poverty. This doesn't mean the government doesn't have a role to play. Indeed, wherever possible, the government and private charities should require people to work in exchange for social assistance. When we do this, we help people in two ways. First, through welfare, we're helping them meet their immediate material needs. And second, through work, we're helping them earn their own success, the key to a fulfilling and dignified life. Whether we're progressive or conservative, shouldn't that be what we want for our fellow citizens? I'm Arthur Brooks, president of the American Enterprise Institute for Prager University.
Do you believe that good and evil exist? The answer to this question separates Judeo-Christian values from secular values. Let me offer the clearest possible example: murder. Is murder wrong? Is it evil? Nearly everyone would answer yes, but now I will pose a much harder question. How do you know? I'm sure you think murder is wrong, but how do you know? If I asked you how you know that the earth is round, you would show me photographs from outer space or offer me measurable data. But what photographs could you show? What measurements could you provide that prove that murder or rape or theft is wrong? The fact is, you can't. There are scientific facts, but without God, there are no moral facts. In a secular world, there can only be opinions about morality. They may be personal opinions or society's opinions, but only opinions. Every atheist philosopher I have read or debated on this subject has acknowledged that if there is no God, there is no objective morality. Judeo-Christian values are predicated on the existence of a God of morality. In other words, only if there is a God who says murder is murder wrong. Otherwise, all morality is opinion. The entire Western world, what we call Western civilization, is based on this understanding. Now, let me make two things clear. First, this doesn't mean that if you don't believe in God, you can't be a good person. There are plenty of kind and moral individuals who don't believe in God and Judeo-Christian values. But the existence of these good people has nothing to do with the question of whether good and evil really exist if there is no God. Second, there have been plenty of people who believed in God who were not good people. Indeed, more than a few have been evil and have even committed evil in God's name. The existence of God doesn't ensure people will do good. I wish it did. The existence of God only ensures that good and evil objectively exist and are not merely opinions. Without God, we therefore end up with what is known as moral relativism, meaning that morality is not absolute, but only relative to the individual or to the society. Without God, the words good and evil are just another way of saying I like and I don't like. If there is no God, the statement murder is evil is the same as the statement I don't like murder. Now, many will argue that you don't need moral absolutes. People won't murder because they don't want to be murdered. But that argument is just wishful thinking. Hitler, Stalin, and Mao didn't want to be murdered, but that hardly stopped them from murdering about 100 million people. It is not a coincidence that the rejection of Judeo-Christian values in the Western world by Nazism and communism led to the murder of all these innocent people. It is also not a coincidence that the first societies in the world to abolish slavery, an institution that existed in every known society in human history, were Western societies rooted in Judeo-Christian values. And so were the first societies to affirm universal human rights, to emancipate women, and to proclaim the value of liberty. Today, the rejection of Judeo-Christian values and moral absolutes has led to a world of moral confusion. In the New York Times in March 2015, a professor of philosophy confirmed this. He wrote, "What would you say if you found out that our public schools were teaching children that it is not true that it's wrong to kill people for fun? Would you be surprised? I was." The professor then added, "The overwhelming majority of college freshmen view moral claims as mere opinions." So then, whatever you believe about God or religion, here is a fact. Without a God who is the source of morality, morality is just a matter of opinion. So, if you want a good world, the death of Judeo-Christian values should frighten you. I'm Dennis Prager.
Many American millennials seem to be drawn to socialism. They came out in big numbers for Bernie Sanders in the 2016 presidential primaries. They rail against capitalism on their college campuses. They wear Che Guevara t-shirts to signal their socialist virtue. I know a lot about socialism. I live in Rio de Janeiro, and I work throughout Brazil as a journalist for a popular magazine. In the early 2000s, Brazil's economy was growing rapidly. The government had enacted economic and monetary reforms and divested holdings in some state-run companies, giving the private sector more room to breathe. Inflation, a chronic problem in Brazil, was dramatically reduced. Foreign investors poured into the country, eager to catch a portion of our expanding economy. The future seemed promising. But today, Our economy is in shambles, unemployment and debt are massive, and powerful politicians are being investigated for involvement in the largest scandals of fraud and corruption in the country's history. What happened? In 2002, a socialist politician named Lula da Silva ran for the presidency. He was a socialist, but painted himself as a modern, cool kind of socialist. He would be the politician who would heal national divisions and unite everyone. He even had a nickname, Lulinha Paz e Amor, which means Little Lula Peace and Love in Portuguese. But the old message about the need for income redistribution to decrease inequality was still there. The media, academic elite, and celebrities assured Brazilians that by transferring the money from the rich to the poor could finally be richer. But the only ones who really got rich were Lula and his corporate and political friends. It only got worse under his successor, Dilma Rousseff. The socialists increased government spending, deficits, and debt. They called it a stimulus. They increased the minimum wage and the benefits of social programs. They call it social justice. They increased the salaries and retirement benefits of the civil service. They called it investing in the future. They handed out thousands of jobs in the government and state-owned companies as favors to their political allies. And they called it good governance. It worked for a while. Socialism always works at the beginning. But government spending just kept going up, and then Lula's socialist paradise fell apart and the economy fell with it. The outcome? From 2008 to 2015, government spending grew nearly 4 times as fast as tax revenue. The economy shrank 3.8% in 2015, the worst result in 25 years. That same year, a World Bank survey found Brazil's economy to be one of the world's worst. Out of 189 countries, we were the 16th hardest place to open a business, the 60th most difficult nation in which to register property, and the 12th most complex place to pay taxes. Economically and morally, the almost 15 years of socialist policies have greatly harmed Brazil. We also remain among the world's leaders in murder and robbery, and we rank near the bottom of industrialized nations in terms of education and healthcare. Americans take it for granted that they can be born into the lower class and reach the middle or even upper class. Many Brazilians take it for granted that they can't. But finally, some things are starting to change. There may be reason for hope. Today, more and more Brazilians see that capitalism and limited government are the only way forward. Thankfully for Brazil, Lula has been charged in several lawsuits for corruption, involvement in a criminal organization, influence peddling, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. Rousseff was impeached in 2016 for falsifying the government's finances and illegally using money from state-owned banks to run the government. This crisis prompted the new government to freeze federal spending, reduce the government's role in state-owned companies, and to encourage some of the massive federal workforce to resign. No one knows whether these basic measures will be enough to rescue Brazil economically. Truthfully, the damage has been so extensive it may take decades for the country to recover. But if we do, it won't be socialism that saves us. American millennials, take note. I am Felipe Moura Brasil for Prager University.
It's appalling that, in the 21st century, there is still so little diversity on American college campuses. This cannot stand. It's not who we are. It's intolerable. It's time we demand a change. It's time to stage a protest, to storm the dean's office. We will not be ignored. Diversity is our strength. I'm not talking about diversity of skin color. Been there, done that. Today's campuses are more racially integrated than at any time in history. And I'm not talking about gender diversity. Women already make up the majority of college graduates. And if your concern is non-binary gender, there is no place on earth more accepting of hims, hers, zims, and zers than a college campus. I'm not even talking about sexual diversity. You can pretty much experiment with anyone you want, in any way you want, as long as you get a consent form signed and notarized in advance. No, the diversity I'm talking about is diversity of thought. Let me say it again in case you missed it. Diversity of thought. That's right. People expressing different points of view on an issue. At most colleges today, that's a dangerous, revolutionary idea if that different point of view is not on the left. The moment you enter college, you enter an indoctrination center. Remember orientation week? It starts there and never stops. They tell you to be open-minded, but they don't really mean it. Almost all your professors are on the left, nearly 12-to-1, left to right, according to a recent study by Econo Journal Watch. There are many departments at many colleges that don't have a single conservative voice. The administration invariably supports leftist positions. And all those diversity administrators, they depend for their livelihood, that means their paycheck, on creating victims. Diversity of race, or gender, or sexuality, or any of the other distinctions du jour that universities glorify are, at best, superficial, and at worst, just plain destructive. It's destructive to any real learning. If you don't study Shakespeare because he was a white male, you have been deprived of learning from the most brilliant playwright who ever lived. And it's destructive of a peaceful campus environment because it pits racial, ethnic, and gender groups against one another. In other words, diversity, as practiced on your typical college campus, divides, not unites people. And diversity of thought, the free exchange of ideas, you know, what college is actually supposed to be about, not happening. If you've been in college for a few years, ask yourself this. When was the last time you heard a professor or a TA make the argument that capitalism has lifted more people out of poverty than any other economic system? Or that socialism always leads to poverty? Or that the post-World War II order created by America has been the freest and most prosperous time in human history? Or that the cause of high crime rates in black communities has very little to do with historic racism? And God forbid if a conservative speaker should show up on campus and dare say any of these things. If the ideas of the people on the right have so little merit, why bother to protest? Shouldn't their bad ideas just die on their own? Isn't the purpose of a liberal education to expose students to differing points of view? Turns out that the liberal in liberal education means leftist. Here's how the University of California at Berkeley, the pinnacle of political correctness, describes itself. Our goal is to transform UC Berkeley into an equitable and inclusive academy of the highest caliber, one that fully honors the diversity of our students, faculty, and staff. Give me a break. Berkeley needs to be transformed. It's not diverse enough. After all these years of expanding equity and inclusion, bull crap. It positively reeks of sexist heteropatriarchy. Say that 3 times. I don't know what it means, but it sure sounds bad. Walk around the Berkeley campus, or almost any campus, and you'll see plenty of blacks, Hispanics, gays, lesbians, even a straight white guy or two. College is a place where they want everyone to look different, but think exactly the same. It's like a freaking cult. At some point, you have to stand up, separate yourself from the crowd, and say, enough. It's time to diversify thought on campus. It's time to demand a real education. God knows, you're paying for it. I'm Charlie Kirk, president of Turning Point USA for Prager University.
The first thing you should know about me, I'm a very lucky guy. The second thing you should know is I'm blind, and that's why I'm wearing these. I was born with retinal cancer, and at 10 months old, I lost my left eye. And at 12 years old, I lost my right. So why am I so lucky then? I'll give you 3 reasons. I have a loving and supporting family. I play competitive golf, which I love. And I'm the long snapper for the University of Southern California, which I love even more. But there's another reason why I'm lucky. And that's because even though I'm blind, even though I have special needs, I got a great education. There is 6.5 million public school students in the United States who, like me, have special needs. Some of them have more serious disabilities than I do. Some of them less. but most aren't as lucky as I am. I went to Orange Lutheran, a private high school in Southern California. My school gave me a tutor that was able to help me through calculus and other advanced placement courses. They gave me the same opportunities and expectations as any other student. And now I go to a great college. But this was only possible because I was born into a family that could afford private school. In California, that's the only way special needs students can be assured a good education. Why? Because in California and in most states, if you're a special needs student, you don't have any choices. If you cannot afford a private school, you are stuck in going to the public school that the government chooses for you. I tried that at first, but right off the bat, there were problems. All the special needs students in my district were grouped into one class. Academic ability didn't matter, interest didn't matter. It only mattered that you had a disability. Even if I were to outperform other students, say in honors chemistry, I couldn't take the class with them because I was blind. And this was in Orange County, California, home to some of the nation's top public schools. Imagine what it's like in less fortunate communities. But thanks to my parents, I had options. So I left the public school and went to a private one. But what about the millions of special needs students in middle to lower income families? Don't they deserve the same opportunities that I had? Of course they do. And that's why I'm for school choice. With school choice, the money follows the student. Every child receives funding that their parents can direct to the school that best fits their needs. Public, private, charter, even homeschool. No one is stuck in a school that doesn't work for them. 12 states already employ school choice programs for special needs students, and it works. One great example comes from Florida. The McKay Scholarship Program for students with disabilities gives kids the choice to attend the public school in their district, a public school in another district, or even a private school. A study by the Manhattan Institute showed marked improvement in reading and math scores for the students in the program. Not surprisingly, this program is becoming more popular. In 2009, 20,000 special needs students enrolled. In 2015, that number had grown to over 31,000. But instead of trying to duplicate this success, teachers' unions and the politicians in their pocket cling to the old model, which benefits them, not students. In states like California, New York, and even Texas, they have managed to block school choice entirely. But fortunately, they don't have the final say. More and more Americans believe that special needs students deserve a quality education. It shouldn't depend on whether you're lucky enough to be born into a family that can afford private school, or whether you're lucky enough to be born in the right district or right state. It shouldn't depend on luck at all. No one sees this more clearly than I do. I'm Jake Olson for Prager University.
We've all heard about how many bad things the U.S. government did to American Indians in the past. But what about today? Like most people, the only time I hear about today's American Indians is when people are outraged about sports mascots or team names, like the Washington Redskins. But sports teams' names are the least of Indians' problems. Did you know that Indians have the highest rate of poverty of any racial group in America? Did you know that alcoholism is more common among Indian youths than among youths in any other ethnic group? Did you know that the rate of child abuse among Indians is twice as high as the national average? Until I visited Indian reservations for my book, The New Trail of Tears, I didn't know any of this. What was at the root of these terrible problems, I wondered? And the deeper I dug, the more I realized that between the 19th century and today, nothing has changed. It's still the government. The two main agencies that oversee the activities of Indians who live on reservations are the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or BIA, and the Bureau of Indian Education, or BIE. Education, economic development, tribal courts, road maintenance, agriculture, and social services. The federal government basically funds and controls all of it. It's no wonder Indians say BIA stands for Bossing Indians Around. Together, these two agencies have combined budgets of $3 billion per year and have 9,000 employees. That's one employee for every 111 Indians on a reservation. Of that $3 billion per year, the BIE uses $850 million of it to educate 42,000 students. That's more than $20,000 per student, compared to a national average of $12,400 per student. Plenty of other federal agencies also have programs for Indians. For instance, the Indian Health Service had a 2015 budget of over $4.6 billion. And yet there are widespread and documented reports of nurses being unable to administer basic drugs, of broken resuscitation equipment, and of unsanitary medical facilities. Obviously, inadequate funding isn't the problem. The billions of dollars that the federal government spends on Indians every year hasn't made their lives better. In fact, by most measures of economic and social health, the lives of American Indians are only getting worse. Aside from issues of culture, the only way out of this morass is economic growth. But the reservation system makes this almost impossible. Following a series of treaties and laws over many decades, some well-intentioned, some not, the federal government decided to hold Indian land, quote, in trust, in order to prevent non-Indians from ever buying that land. But other than Indians, the only people who have things held in trust for them are children and the mentally incompetent. Can anything better illustrate the low regard the government has for American Indians? The awful consequence of this land trust is that Indians can't sell their land, which means they can't use it the same way other Americans do, for example, as collateral to get a loan to start a business. What bank would lend to landowners who don't own their land? The other effect of this absurdity is that Indians can't develop this land that they don't own. Indian reservations contain almost 30% of the nation's coal reserves west of the Mississippi, 50% of potential uranium reserves, and 20% of known oil and gas reserves. Those resources are estimated to be worth nearly $1.5 trillion. But the vast majority of Indian lands with natural resources remain undeveloped because of federal regulations. For instance, for Indians to get permission to mine for coal on Indian land requires 49 steps spanning 4 federal agencies. Each of these 49 steps can take months or years to be approved. There are so many government regulations that just to apply for a permit to dig a hole cost $6,500. Is it really any wonder that this community is mired in poverty? So what can be done? For starters, end the trust system. Let Indians do what they want with the land they own. Get the massive federal bureaucracy out of the way. Give American Indians the opportunity to embrace the same thing that has lifted millions of other people out of poverty and into the middle class: free enterprise. It won't happen overnight, and it won't be easy, but it will do a lot more for American Indians than changing the name of the Washington Redskins. I'm Naomi Schaefer Riley for Prager University.
When people describe particularly evil individuals or regimes, why is it that they use the terms Nazi or fascist, but almost never communist? Given the unparalleled amount of human suffering communists have caused, why is communist so much less a term of revulsion than Nazi? Communists killed 70 million people in China, more than 20 million people in the Soviet Union, not including about 5 million Ukrainians, and almost 1 out of every 3 Cambodians. And communists enslaved entire nations in Russia, Vietnam, China, Eastern Europe, North Korea, Cuba, and much of Central Asia. They ruined the lives of well over 1 billion people. So why doesn't communism have the same terrible reputation as Nazism? Reason number 1, there is, simply put, widespread ignorance of the communist record. Whereas both right and left loathe Nazism and teach its evil history, the left, and I'm talking about the left, not traditional liberals like Harry Truman or John F. Kennedy, has never loathed communism. And since the left dominates academia, almost no one teaches communism's evil history. Reason number 2, the Nazis carried out the Holocaust. Nothing matches the Holocaust for pure evil. The rounding up of virtually every Jewish man, woman, child, and baby on the European continent and sending them to die is unprecedented and unparalleled. The communists killed far more people than the Nazis, but never matched the Holocaust in the systemization of genocide. The uniqueness of the Holocaust and the enormous attention rightly paid to it have helped ensure that Nazism has a worse name than communism. Reason number 3. Communism is based on nice-sounding theories. Nazism isn't. It's based on heinous-sounding theories. Intellectuals in general, including, of course, the intellectuals who write history, are seduced by words, so much so that they deem actions as less significant than words. For that reason, they haven't focused nearly as much attention on the horrific actions of communists as they have on the horrific actions of the Nazis. They dismiss the evils of communists as perversions of true communism, but they regard Nazi atrocities, correctly, as the logical and inevitable results of Nazism. Reason number 4. Germans have thoroughly exposed the evils of Nazism, have taken responsibility for them, and have attempted to atone for them. Russians have not done anything similar regarding Lenin's or Stalin's horrors. To the contrary, Lenin, the father of Soviet communism, is still widely venerated in Russia. And as regards Stalin, as University of London Russian historian Donald Rayfield puts it, quote, people still deny, by assertion or implication, Stalin's Holocaust, unquote. Even less so as China exposed the greatest mass murderer and enslaver of them all, Mao Zedong. Mao remains revered in China. Every Chinese currency note has his picture on it. Until Russia and China and Vietnam and Cuba and North Korea acknowledge the evils their countries committed under communism, communism's evils will remain less known than the evils of the German state under Hitler. Reason number 5. Communists murdered mostly their own people. The Nazis, on the other hand, killed very few fellow Germans. World opinion, that largely meaningless and amoral term, deems the murder of members of one's own group far less noteworthy than the murder of outsiders. That's why, for example, blacks killing millions of fellow blacks in Africa elicits almost no attention from world opinion. And reason number 6. In the view of the left, the last good war was World War II, the war against German Nazism and Japanese fascism. The left does not regard wars against communist regimes as good wars. For example, the American war against Vietnamese communism is regarded as immoral, and the war against Korean communism and its Chinese communist backers is simply ignored. Until the left and all the institutions influenced by the left acknowledge how evil communism has been, we will continue to live in a morally confused world. In the meantime, all good people owe it to the victims of communism to learn what happened to them. Even worse than being murdered or enslaved is a world that doesn't even know that you were. I'm Dennis Prager.
Vanderbilt University, November 2015. 200 students rise up to protest the white privilege and microaggressions of the racist, bigoted Vanderbilt administration. The protesters don't offer any specific examples of discrimination, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that they feel victimized. The next day, a bag of dog poop shows up at the front door of the university's Black Cultural Center. All hell breaks loose. Full of righteous indignation, student activist groups rush to Facebook to denounce the racist act. The police investigate. They quickly find the person responsible, but nobody is arrested. You know why? Because it turns out that the bag of excrement wasn't a racist attack. It was left by a blind girl with a service dog. She couldn't find a trash can, so, wanting to do the responsible thing, she left the bag outside the door of a nearby building, knowing a janitor would pick it up and throw it away. The student group did apologize, but then they added another charge against the administration. The needs of students with disabilities on this campus are also marginalized. Seriously, this is not a joke. On the college campus today, feelings rule facts and victims are heroes. According to the left, all inequality in America is due to victimization. They start by claiming that all non-white people in America are victims of white privilege. Then come women. They're all victims of the patriarchy. Then come gays and lesbians and the transgendered. They're all victims of our heteronormative and homophobic society. But what if you haven't actually been victimized by anybody? That doesn't matter. To the left, so long as you feel victimized, you're a victim. Even if you have never actually experienced discrimination, you've surely been targeted by microaggressions. Nasty little words and phrases that weren't meant to be insults, but just are. If somebody asks you, where are you from, that's considered a xenophobic microaggression. They're implying that you are a foreigner. If a man holds open a door for a woman, which, by the way, you're supposed to do, that's a sexist microaggression because he's treating her like she's a helpless female. Of course, he's also treating her like she's a woman. But how would he know? And heaven forbid anybody address you by your biologically accurate pronoun. What if she identifies as a man? In short, everyone's a victim, except, of course, straight white males. Also, anybody who dares to disagree with the left. If you're guilty of either of those crimes, you must be confronted, even if doing so requires actual aggression, like, say, a riot. Here's a trick the left plays to justify their violence. First, they say it's okay to punch Nazis. Then they say that every conservative, in fact, everybody they disagree with, is a Nazi. But here's the biggest problem with the left's argument. They're based on feelings, not facts. Take white privilege. The only real privilege in America is American privilege. Everybody in America has it, more than citizens of any other country in the world, the privilege to make your own decisions and live the life you choose. According to the liberal Brookings Institution, if you make just these 3 decisions, you'll do fine. And with drive and ambition, you'll probably do better than fine. First, finish high school. Second, don't have babies before you're married. Third, hold down a job. If you do these 3 things, you'll be on your way to the privilege of middle-class life, regardless of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or gender. Also, there's no patriarchy. Women already make up the majority of college graduates. According to Time magazine, young single women without kids already earn more than their male counterparts. Oh, and gay and lesbian couples, they earn more than their straight counterparts too. These are facts, and facts don't care about your feelings. Neither will your employer if you get a job after you leave school. The moment you graduate, reality is going to hit you like a truck. People who give you a paycheck expect you to produce. They expect you to work hard. And all the claims of victimhood, all the whining, well, nobody cares. So, stop worrying so much about your feelings and start worrying a little more about being a good person, doing your best, and not getting in your own way. If you don't, the only thing you'll be a victim of is yourself. I'm Ben Shapiro, editor of the Daily Wire for Prager University.
When you think about racial equality and civil rights, which political party comes to mind? The Republicans or the Democrats? Most people would probably say the Democrats, but this answer is incorrect. Since its founding in 1829, the Democratic Party has fought against every major civil rights initiative and has a long history of discrimination. The Democratic Party defended slavery, started the Civil War, opposed Reconstruction, founded the Ku Klux Klan, imposed segregation, perpetrated lynchings, and fought against the Civil Rights Acts of the 1950s and 1960s. In contrast, the Republican Party was founded in 1854 as an anti-slavery party. Its mission was to stop the spread of slavery into the new Western territories with the aim of abolishing it entirely. This effort, however, was dealt a major blow by the Supreme Court in the 1857 case Dred Scott versus Sandford. The court ruled that slaves aren't citizens, they're property. The 7 justices who voted in favor of slavery, all Democrats. The 2 justices who dissented, both Republicans. The slavery question was, of course, ultimately resolved by a bloody civil war. The commander-in-chief during that war was the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, the man who freed the slaves. 6 days after the Confederate Army surrendered, John Wilkes Booth, a Democrat, assassinated President Lincoln. Lincoln's vice president, a Democrat named Andrew Johnson, assumed the presidency. But Johnson adamantly opposed Lincoln's plan to integrate the newly freed slaves into the South's economic and social order. Johnson and the Democratic Party were unified in their opposition to the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which gave blacks citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, which gave blacks the vote. All three passed only because of universal Republican support. During the era of Reconstruction, federal troops stationed in the South helped secure rights for the newly freed slaves. Hundreds of black men were elected to Southern state legislatures as Republicans, and 22 black Republicans served in the U.S. Congress by 1900. The Democrats did not elect a black man to Congress until 1935. But after Reconstruction ended, when the federal troops went home, Democrats roared back into power in the South. They quickly reestablished white supremacy across the region with measures like black codes, laws that restricted the ability of blacks to own property and run businesses, and they imposed poll taxes and literacy tests used to subvert black citizens' right to vote. And how was all of this enforced? By terror, much of it instigated by the Ku Klux Klan, founded by a Democrat, Nathan Bedford Forrest. As historian Eric Foner, himself a Democrat, notes, in effect, the Klan was a military force serving the interests of the Democratic Party. President Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, shared many views with the Klan. He resegregated many federal agencies and even screened the first movie ever played at the White House, the racist film, The Birth of a Nation, originally entitled The Klansman. A few decades later, the only serious congressional opposition to the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 came from Democrats. 80% of Republicans in Congress supported the bill, less than 70% of Democrats did. Democratic senators filibustered the bill for 75 days until Republicans mustered the few extra votes needed to break the logjam. And when all of their efforts to enslave blacks, keep them enslaved, and then keep them from voting had failed, the Democrats came up with a new strategy. If black people are going to vote, they might as well vote for Democrats, as President Lyndon Johnson was purported to have said about the Civil Rights Act. I'll have them voting Democrat for 200 years. So now, the Democratic Party prospers on the votes of the very people it has spent much of its history oppressing. Democrats falsely claim that the Republican Party is the villain, when in reality, it's the failed policies of the Democratic Party that have kept blacks down. Massive government welfare has decimated the black family. Opposition to school choice has kept them trapped in failing schools. Politically correct policing has left black neighborhoods defenseless against violent crime. So when you think about racial equality and civil rights, which political party should come to mind? I'm Carol Swain, professor of political science and law at Vanderbilt University for Prager University.
The Vietnam War lasted 10 years, cost America 58,000 lives, and over $1 trillion adjusted for inflation. It brought down a president, stirred social unrest, and ended in defeat. No one in hindsight believes fighting a losing war is ever worth the cost. Consequently, the Vietnam War is usually written off as a colossal strategic blunder and a humanitarian disaster. Yet historical appraisals might have been much different had the Vietnam War followed the pattern of the Korean War, which the United States fought for almost identical reasons, the defense of freedom in Asia. The U.S. had military advisors in Vietnam during the 1950s, but didn't become involved in a major way until 1963. President John F. Kennedy firmly believed in the domino effect, the foreign policy theory that vulnerable nations without help would fall one after another, like dominoes, to external communist aggression. Kennedy thus hoped to stop Soviet and Chinese-backed communist invasions in the manner President Harry Truman had in Korea by taking a stand in Vietnam. As with Korea was a war the United States did not seek. As with Korea, Vietnam presented no imperial advantages, no natural resources, or resources of any kind that the United States needed to protect or wished to obtain. As with Korea, the aggressor was a communist government in the North intent on taking control of the South, and its military crossed an internationally recognized border to do so. Following Kennedy's assassination in November of 1963, President Lyndon Johnson vastly escalated America's role in 1964. But even as he did so, Johnson prosecuted the war with deep ambivalence, authorizing significantly more troops and money for the war, but never pushing for total victory. In contrast, the North Vietnamese never wavered. They ignored every one of Johnson's many offers to negotiate a settlement. By 1971, the war was at a stalemate, neither side able to establish a clear advantage. The President, Richard Nixon, pursued a two-pronged strategy: to turn over combat operations to the South Vietnamese and to bomb North Vietnam. The effort brought the Communists to the Paris peace talks, and by 1973 the North agreed to a general settlement, establishing two autonomous Vietnamese nations, one communist, one non-communist, in the manner of North and South Korea. However, the Watergate scandal, the subsequent resignation of President Nixon, and the Democrats' sweeping congressional victory in the 1974 midterm election all helped to convince the North Vietnamese that America would not enforce the peace agreement. They were right. Without U.S. air support and material aid, the South Vietnamese had no chance against the North. Well supplied by the Soviet Union and the Chinese, the Communists gained full control over the country in April 1975. The war proved far more costly than Korea because the geography and landscapes of Vietnam were far more conducive to insurgency operations. There were also far more restrictions placed on American commanders than during the Korean War. And the United States in the 1960s was a far less conservative and cohesive country than America of the 1950s. Yet despite the long ordeal and terrible costs, South Vietnam was saved in 1973, only to be lost in 1975. The U.S. defeat in Vietnam was a political choice, not a military necessity. Had the U.S. protected an independent but vulnerable South Vietnam in 1973 and 4, that country would have most likely followed the model of South Korea. Millions of Southeast Asians would not have become boat people and refugees or have been sent to the gulags and re-education camps. A viable U.S.-backed democratic Vietnam would have stabilized the region and almost certainly prevented the neighboring Cambodian genocide, in which 1/5 of that country, 2 million people, were slaughtered by its communist leadership. And much of the bitterness over the war on both sides of the American political spectrum, still with us today, would have vanished. And for the communist Vietnamese, the instigators and aggressors of the terrible conflict, what was it all for? Today, ironically, the Vietnamese government aspires to nothing more than the capitalist affluence that it once reviled. I'm Victor Davis Hanson of the Hoover Institution for Prager University.
Every sensible immigration policy has two objectives. One, to regain control of our borders so that we decide who enters, and two, to find a humane way to deal with the 11 million illegal immigrants who now live among us. Start with the second. For both practical and moral reasons, America cannot and will not and should not expel 11 million people. That leaves us with two choices: ignore them or figure out a way to legalize them. Ignoring them hasn't worked, but there's also a huge problem with legalization. It creates an irresistible incentive for new illegal immigrants to come. We say, of course, that this will be the very last, very final, never again, we're not kidding this time, amnesty. And everyone knows it's phony. That's what was said in 1986 when we passed the Simpson-Mazzoli immigration reform. It turned out to be the largest legalization program in American history. Nearly 3 million people got permanent residency. There was no enforcement. We now have 11 million new illegal immigrants in our midst. The irony of this whole debate, which bitterly splits the country, is that there is a silver bullet that would not just solve the problem, but also create a national consensus behind it. A vast number of Americans who oppose legalization and fear new waves of immigration would change their minds if we could radically reduce new, i.e. future, illegal immigration. And we can. First, build a barrier. Call it a wall, call it a fence, call it what you will. Add cameras and sensors, add drones, beef up the patrols. All that matters is that we regain control of the border. Fences work. The triple fence outside San Diego led to a 90% reduction in infiltration. Israel's border fence with the West Bank produced a similar decline. Even holier-than-thou Europeans have conceded the point. Hungary, Macedonia, Bulgaria, Austria, Greece, Spain, why even Norway have all started building border fences to stem the tide of Middle Eastern refugees. Then enforce two other measures: a national e-verify system that makes it just about impossible to work if you're here illegally, and a functioning visa tracking system, since 40% of illegal immigrants are visa overstays. The wall fence will, of course, be ugly. So are the concrete barriers to keep truck bombs from driving into the White House. Sometimes function has to supersede form. And don't tell me that this is our Berlin Wall. When you build a wall to keep people in, that's a prison. When you build a wall to keep people out, that's an expression of sovereignty. Of course, no barrier will be foolproof, but it doesn't have to be. It simply has to reduce the river to a manageable trickle. Once we do, everything becomes possible, including dealing with our 11 million illegal immigrants. So let's fix that. Track the visas, do e-verify, build the damn barrier. It's ridiculous to say that it can't be done. And who would certify that the border is back in our control? I would have a neutral party, perhaps a commission of retired jurists, issue the judgment. Once they do, we legalize the 11 million, granting them the right to stay and work here. We can't give them citizenship. That's a bridge too far. You don't get to join the political destiny of the country by entering it illegally. But any children born here would be American, which means that over time, the issue resolves itself. The American people are legitimately angry at the price American society has paid due to illegal immigration. But they are also a generous people. Once they're assured that we do indeed control our borders, that anger will abate. A national consensus will emerge. Radical border control followed by radical legalization. No mushy compromise. A solution requires two acts of national will: putting up a wall along with e-verify and visa tracking, and absorbing those who broke our laws to come to America. This is not a compromise meant to appease both sides without achieving anything. It's not some piece of hybrid legislation that arbitrarily divides illegals into those with 5-year-old roots in America and those without, or some such mischief-making nonsense. If we do it right, not only will we solve the problem, we will get it done as one nation. I'm Charles Krauthammer for Prager University.
When was the last time you heard a child referred to as obedient? It's probably been a while. That's too bad, because the best research tells us that obedient children are happy children. And from my experience as a family psychologist, the parents of obedient children are happy parents. Since all parents want their children to be happy, the question becomes, how does one get a child to obey? Is there some trick to it? Well, there certainly are a lot of parents who think so. They believe that proper discipline is a matter of using the right methods, techniques, and strategies, what I call consequence delivery systems. Parents have been using these behavior modification-based methods since they became popular in the 1960s, seemingly to no avail. Would anyone argue that today's kids are more obedient than kids were several generations ago? I don't think so. The reason these methods and techniques don't work is that proper discipline is not a matter of proper methods. It's a matter of a proper attitude on the part of the parent. Let me illustrate the point. Let's say that for a week, I observed the classroom of a grade school teacher who has the reputation of being the best disciplinarian in her district. She consistently has fewer behavior problems than any of her colleagues. What is she doing? She's making her expectations perfectly clear, which means, first, She communicates in simple, declarative sentences. She doesn't use 50 words when she could use 10. The more words you use to communicate your expectations, the less confident you sound. Second, she prefaces her instructions to her students with authoritative phrases like, "I want you to," and "it's time for you to." She says, "It's time for you to take out your math books and turn to page 25, as opposed to, let's take out our math books and turn to page 25, okay?" Third, this teacher does not explain the motives behind her instructions to her students. Why? Because she knows that explanations invite arguments. Whenever parents tell me they're dealing with an argumentative child, I know that these well-intentioned people are explaining themselves. They tell their child why they want him to pick up his toys, for example, and he argues, because you can always pick apart an explanation. If you don't explain yourself when you give an instruction to a child, then the child, being a child, is almost surely going to ask for one. He's going to ask, why? Or why not? At which point, get ready for a big surprise. Your answer should be, because I said so. These very useful 4 words, and no, they will not cause psychological damage to your kids. Quite the contrary, are a simple but powerful affirmation of the legitimacy of your authority. Say it calmly. Don't scream it. Nothing good is ever accomplished by a person who screams. Last but certainly not least, when giving instructions to a child, do not, let me repeat, do not bend down to the child's level. Getting a child to do what he or she is told is a matter of looking and acting and talking like you have complete confidence in your authority. Bending down to a child's level does not look authoritative. It looks, in fact, like you're one movement away from being down on your knees in front of a king. I know you've read somewhere that you should get down to a child's level when you talk to him. Well, all I can tell you is that there's a lot of really bad parenting advice out there, and that's but one example. Speak to children from an upright position. That causes them to look up to you, and that is a good thing for them and for you both. I'm John Rosemond, author and family psychologist for Prager University.
He was one of America's most popular presidents, handsome, charismatic, a war hero. He believed a strong military was the best guarantor of peace. He explained that cutting taxes was the best way to grow the economy. He firmly opposed racial quotas and was horrified by the idea of unrestricted abortions. Can you name him? Here's one more clue. He was not a Republican. The answer? John F. Kennedy. When he was elected president in 1960, Kennedy's views were considered mainstream in the Democratic Party. But while the Kennedy name is still revered by the Democrats today, the policies he espoused are not. Ronald Reagan, America's 40th president, who was a Democrat much of his life, famously said, "I didn't leave the Democratic Party, the party left me." So, if Kennedy were alive now, which party would he belong to? It's impossible to know, of course, but we can compare his political positions to those of today's Democratic Party. On race, JFK disliked the idea of using racial preferences and quotas to make up for historic racism and discrimination. Today, affirmative action is Democratic Party orthodoxy, but Kennedy thought such policies were counterproductive. "I don't think we can undo the past," Kennedy said. "We have to do the best we can now. I don't think quotas are a good idea. We are too mixed, this society of ours, to begin to divide ourselves on the basis of race or color." On taxes, Kennedy was an ardent proponent of across-the-board tax cuts, believing that more cash in the hands of all Americans, including the so-called wealthy, and a lighter footprint from the IRS would grow the economy. A tax cut means higher family income and higher business profits, Kennedy said in an address to the nation shortly before his death. Every taxpayer and his family will have more money left over after taxes for a new car, a new home, new conveniences, education, and investment. Every businessman can keep a higher percentage of his profits in his cash register or put it to work expanding or improving his business. On foreign policy, Kennedy was very firm about his red lines. When the Soviet Union built missile sites in Cuba, leading to what is known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy threatened a decisive military response. The Soviet Union backed down. JFK believed, as Ronald Reagan did, in peace through strength, not strength through peace. In his inaugural address, Kennedy made the case for a strong U.S. military. He saw this as the only way to deter America's enemies. Only when our arms are sufficient beyond doubt, he said, can we be certain beyond doubt that they will never be employed. On gun rights, Kennedy was one of 8 U.S. presidents who was a lifetime member of the NRA. Here's what he said about the Second Amendment. We need a nation of Minutemen, citizens who are not only prepared to take up arms, but citizens who regard the preservation of freedom as a basic purpose of their daily life, and who are willing to consciously work and sacrifice for that freedom. On abortion, Kennedy was assassinated a decade before the landmark Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade. Abortion was not a major issue during his administration, but we do know that he nominated Justice Byron White, a Democrat, to the Supreme Court. White was one of 2 justices who dissented in Roe v. Wade. We also know that Kennedy abhorred Japan's post-World War II use of abortion as a means of population control, saying, "On the question of limiting population, as you know, the Japanese have been doing it very vigorously through abortion, which I think would be repugnant to all Americans." Today, if a Democrat advocated the positions on race, taxes, foreign policy, guns, and abortion that our 35th president once did, he wouldn't be a Democrat. He belonged to that other party. I'm Larry Elder for Prager University.
You've probably heard a lot of people recently screaming and yelling about fake news. Charges fly from all points on the political spectrum. This story is mistaken. It's fake news. That statement is incorrect. It's fake news. But to my mind, these arguments miss the point. Mainstream American news is all fake because the major news outlets are so consistently biased toward the left that whether any given story they report is factual or not, their overall reportage is essentially leftist propaganda. You can complain about the right-wing slant of Fox News all you want, but left-wing ABC, CBS, NBC, MSNBC, and CNN have combined almost 10 times the viewers. Look, the chief journalist at ABC is former Clinton operative George Stephanopoulos. The president of CBS News is David Rhodes, the brother of a former senior Obama staffer. Comcast, which owns NBC, is run by a major Democrat donor. Same for the leadership at CBS and Time Warner, which owns CNN. Only 7% of American journalists identify as Republican. And while a lot of news outlets forbid their reporters to donate to candidates, 96% of those who did donate last time out gave to Hillary Clinton. These journalists claim that despite the fact they're all Democrats, they can be objective. It just ain't so. Psychologists have shown that when people associate almost exclusively with those who agree with them, they suffer from groupthink and confirmation bias and lose their ability to see events clearly. Now, it's not that these journalists are liars, exactly. It's that their bias skews their reporting in very specific ways. Let me give you Andrew Klavan's 3 rules of mainstream media journalism. These can transform any story, whether it's true or not, into fake news. Rule number 1. Whenever left-wing prejudices are confirmed by a single event, that event is treated as representative. But whenever left-wing prejudices are contradicted by a single event, that event is treated as an isolated incident. And if you treat it as representative, you are deemed to be hateful. So for instance, a white cop shoots a black suspect. The mainstream media treats that story as representative of general police racism, even though studies show cops don't use deadly force more often on blacks than on whites. On the other hand, if a Muslim commits an act of terrorism and someone is bold enough to point out that the terrorist act is in fact representative of the daily acts of Muslim terror around the world, this is considered Islamophobic. The leftist media cherry picks when an event illustrates a larger narrative. That's fake news. Rule number 2. When a scandal breaks on the right, the news is the scandal. When a scandal breaks on the left, the news is who wrongfully disclosed that scandalous information. Thus, when the media wanted to raise suspicions that Donald Trump was somehow in league with the Russians, they freely quoted illegally leaked information from intelligence sources. But when Congressman Devin Nunes announced he had information that the Obama administration might have misused intelligence against Donald Trump's transition team, the story became, how did Nunes get that information? And did he do it legally? The scandal meter is heavily weighted to fall to the right. Fake news. Rule number 3. Individual extremists on the right are highlighted, but the overall extremism of the left is ignored. In one of the fakest fake news stories in recent history, the mainstream media rose up as one to tar conservative Tea Party members as racist, when all they really wanted were lower taxes and less government spending. Reporters gave the Tea Party disparaging nicknames, represented their almost universally peaceful gatherings as ugly and violent. And whenever an individual Tea Partier said something wrong, it was cited as evidence that the movement itself was tainted. Meanwhile, the continually violent, vandalizing, anti-Semitic socialist movement that went by the name of Occupy Wall Street was hailed by journalists as an important social development, right up to the moment it vanished without a trace, except for the piles of litter its protesters left behind. Peaceful Tea Partiers wanted the small government prescribed by the Constitution, so they were radicals. Violent occupiers wanted the widespread government intrusion of socialism, so they were heroes. Very fake news. Newsweek editor Evan Thomas was once criticized when his magazine essentially convicted some white Duke University lacrosse players of raping a black woman. A rape it turns out they did not commit because it didn't happen. Thomas defended himself, saying, the narrative was right, but the facts were wrong. The mainstream media almost always get their left-wing narrative right, whether the facts support it or not. That's called confirming your own prejudices. It's called bias. It's called fake news. I'm Andrew Klavan for Prager University.
What role should religion play in a free society? More and more people today would answer, none. That would not have been the answer of the founders of the United States, the men who fought the American Revolution and wrote the country's Constitution. To them, the issue of religion and freedom were inextricably linked. You couldn't have freedom without religion. In fact, the political philosophy of the founders necessitated a divine foundation. Thomas Jefferson makes this clear in the Declaration of Independence when he writes that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. The purpose of government, Jefferson and his compatriots believed, was not to bestow rights. Rather, it was to protect those rights already endowed upon human beings by God. But government isn't enough for a free society. A moral people is also required. That is, a people moral enough to police itself. Virtue or morality, George Washington observed, is a necessary spring of popular government. Thus, for the founders, liberty was not merely the ability to do what one wanted. It came with moral demands and boundaries. They all accepted the rule of life expressed by Benjamin Franklin. Nothing brings more pain than too much pleasure, nothing more bondage than too much liberty. The founders knew that the absolute enemy of freedom was, ironically, a freedom that was absolute and unrestrained. And where was this restraint going to come from? Their answer was religion, which for them, because of when and where they lived, was some variety of Christianity. Let divines and philosophers, statesmen and patriots unite, Samuel Adams wrote, in instructing citizens in the art of self-government. In short, of leading them in the study and practice of the exalted virtues of the Christian system. The Christian system to which Adams refers is composed of Judeo-Christian values. the values rooted in the Old and New Testaments, both of which were referred to by the founders with equal conviction and frequency. Jefferson, yes, the very same Thomas Jefferson who is so often portrayed as anti-religious, confirmed this sentiment in his notes on the state of Virginia, when he asked, "Can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, and that they are not to be violated but with his wrath?" James Madison likewise affirmed the essential connection between religion and morality. The belief in a God all-powerful, wise, and good is essential to the moral order of the world and to the happiness of man. John Adams believed that the doctrine of a supreme, intelligent, wise, almighty sovereign of the universe, a doctrine he credited to Judaism, was the great essential principle of all morality and consequently of all civilization. And he applied this thinking specifically to the new nation he helped to create. Our Constitution, he said, was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. As president, he replied to a letter from university students in a way that would surprise many today. Science, liberty, and religion have an inseparable union. Without their joint influence, no society can be great, flourishing, or happy. Meanwhile, another founder, Alexander Hamilton, looked at the French Revolution and saw something much different. That revolution, unlike the American Revolution, had devolved into violence and chaos. Hamilton believed he understood why. The anti-religious force it unleashed, he wrote, annihilates the foundations of social order and true liberty, confounds all moral distinctions, and substitutes for the mild and beneficent religion of the gospel a gloomy, persecuting, and desolating atheism. For the founders, a free society divorced from religion simply could not work and would not survive. It is no wonder then that in his farewell address, George Washington chastised those who would claim to be patriots and yet undermine the influence of religion. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. The founders did not demand that anyone believe in any particular religion or even in God. Quite the contrary. But while they understood the value of a secular government, they feared a secular society, one without religion. So should we. I'm Joshua Charles, writer and researcher at the Museum of the Bible for Prager University.
Public schools aren't the answer for everyone. They weren't the answer for me. Schools in my neighborhood in Jacksonville, Florida, functioned less as places of learning and more as warehouses to keep kids off the street. I know, I was one of those kids. I don't blame teachers or parents. I'm not interested in blaming anybody. I'm only interested in making things better. And the only way to do that is to give parents and students a choice. If a student can't get the education they need at their public school, there has to be an alternative. Thankfully, there was for me. My early years in my Jacksonville school were not a success, to put it mildly. I seldom understood the lesson. I was often confused and frustrated. I asked my teachers questions, but it seemed to me that this just annoyed them. So I stopped asking questions, and I withdrew into myself. I failed third grade twice. Fourth and fifth weren't much better. I lashed out by getting into fights with my classmates. D's and F's filled my report card. I was going nowhere. I was just another black kid in the warehouse. But fortunately for me, my life changed the summer before sixth grade. I went to live with my godmother. She had one overriding thought: to get me into a better school. A good education, she knew, was the only way to get out of the hole I had dug myself into. She didn't have any more money than my family did, but she had a plan. That was worth a lot. She knew about another school, a private school. Using a tax credit scholarship, you can call it a voucher, she enrolled me at Esprit de Corps Center for Learning. Esprit demands excellence from its students. It teaches them to be warriors for knowledge and for good values. The teachers at Esprit were invested in my success. They took the time to figure out why learning was so difficult for me, and they tailored their instruction to my learning style. Sound elite? It is. Sound expensive? It's not. In fact, Esprit spends less money per student than the public school I had attended. Instead of dreading my classes, I began to look forward to them. Instead of fistfights, I began doing community service work. I even earned the National Police Athletic League's Girl of the Year award in 2009. When it was time for me to apply to college, Esprit even helped me to research scholarships and apply for waivers so that I could take my college entrance test for free. On June 5th, 2010, I graduated from Esprit de Corps with honors, becoming the first member of my immediate family to earn a high school diploma, and eventually the first to earn a college degree, and then a master's. Without school choice, none of this would have been possible. Why is it so hard to grasp? Why are so many people so resistant to children and parents having a choice of schools? The system, especially for economically disadvantaged kids, is broken. I've seen it up close, and I've seen what happens when it works better when there is choice. School choice allows parents who live in undervalued neighborhoods to pick the school that best works for their children. Of course, the opponents of school choice, the politicians, and the teachers' unions who profit off of keeping poor Black kids trapped in the warehouse, say it takes money away from students who need it the most. But does anybody believe that money is the problem? Washington, D.C., for example, spends over $20,000 per student. We don't need any more money. We need more choice. Let's challenge public schools to compete on quality. Only competition breeds excellence. Prosperous parents can choose where to send their kids to school, public, private, or charter, wherever they have the best chance to succeed. Why shouldn't all parents have that choice? We have the money to make it happen. We just need the will. None of us deserve to be imprisoned by our zip codes. Education is the only way out of generational poverty. I'm a living example. Let's help redefine public education to make it work for everybody. There's only one way to do that. School choice. What are we waiting for? I'm Denisha Merriweather for Prager University.
I recently discovered something startling about myself. It turns out that I'm a racist, sexist, misogynist. This came as quite a shock to me. How did this happen? As a person of color, a single woman with a graduate degree who grew up poor in a home without a father, I had a clear political path to follow, and I followed it. I voted for Barack Obama, twice. After all, we share the same skin color. His father was from Africa. Mine was too. What other reasons did I need? I was inspired to see a Black man rise to the highest office in the land. I believed his ascent would herald a new beginning, a new era of racial healing and harmony. We would finally have that frank discussion about race that everyone always talks about. I was also inspired by his wife. I was thrilled to see such a strong, opinionated Black woman take the national stage. But then something happened. Actually, several somethings. I realized there was a big contradiction in my own life. I considered myself a free thinker, but I was thinking exactly what I was supposed to. I decided to start asking questions. I belonged to several campus feminist groups. I was even teaching feminism to inner city girls. Part of that teaching involved making the case for abortion. These girls needed to know that they had the right to make decisions about their own bodies. Surely, I thought, that's empowerment. But one day I asked myself, isn't it men who benefit most from consequence-free sex? Doesn't that give them even more power over women? And of course, abortion certainly doesn't empower the woman it prevents from ever being born. When I began to ask my other feminist friends how they reconcile these issues, they just got angry. I was called anti-woman, even by progressive men. But I'm not anti-woman, I thought. I am a woman. I just don't want to be a weak one. I want to be strong, like Michelle. At about the same time, while I was a student at the University of Texas at Dallas, the UT Austin Department of African Diaspora Studies released a statement in which they said, and I quote, African Americans are disproportionately affected by the saturation of our society by firearms. We demand that firearms be banned in all spaces occupied by Black people on our campus. Wait a second, I thought. Why would you want to ban firearms only in Black areas? Doesn't that mean that you either think Black people are more dangerous than other people or less worthy of protection? These questions did not endear me to my progressive friends. I was called a race traitor, even by white people. But I'm not anti-Black. I am Black. I just want to be safe, like Barack. I realized I didn't have a good answer. I only had more questions. Like, why were Blacks doing so poorly in cities that had been run by Democrats for decades? Was it racism and sexism that was holding people back? Or was it something else? The more questions I asked, the less popular I became. But here's the funny thing. I started to feel better about myself. I decided that the very definition of empowerment required me to take responsibility for my own life. I wasn't going to be anyone's victim, which meant I had to protect myself. So I bought a gun. I started to advocate for gun rights. That cost me more friends. I joined the pro-life movement and walked in the March for Life. More friends, gone. Then I crossed the line. I voted Republican, the party that views me as an empowered individual, able to shape my own destiny, not as a member of a victim group. And that's how I became a racist, sexist, misogynist. I'm Antonia Okafor for Prager University.
Why is the government so bad at health care? They've been at it for 75 years and still can't get it right. It's expensive, access is spotty, it's mired in bureaucracy, and it's fraught with waste. Obamacare was supposed to fix all this, but instead, like every other government health care program before it, it just made things worse. Why? Because the government is a third-party payer. Let me explain. Suppose you're going to buy something for yourself. You have two priorities, price and quality. You want the highest quality for the lowest possible price. Say you're buying a television. You have many options, the size of the screen, the quality of the image, the price. Only you know which one best suits your needs and your budget. And a lot of companies are competing for your business. You do your research, you make your choice. This is called a first-party purchase. The person paying is the person using. Now let us suppose that either the price or the quality is not controlled by you. In this case, you're buying something for someone else. You care about the price because you're paying for it, but you're a little more flexible on the quality. A good example would be a wedding gift, say a coffee maker. You might think, by the time it breaks, they'll forget who gave it to them anyway. The cheaper one will be fine. All of us have bought things for others we never would have bought for ourselves. We care about the price because we're paying for it, but not so much about the quality because we're not going to use it. Or suppose we're going to use something, but we're not going to pay for it. Then we're concerned about the quality because we're consuming it. But the cost is not as important because we're not paying for it. Any father who ever got roped into paying for an open bar at a wedding understands this program. Nobody ever orders the cheap stuff when it's free. These are called second-party purchases. The person paying is not the person using. And now for the coup de grace. When it's not your money paying for something and you don't use it, then you're not concerned about either the price or the quality. Suppose the boss gives you $150 to buy a door prize for the office party. In a store window, you see a 6-foot-tall stuffed frog marked $149. You think, oh, that's perfect. Let's buy it. The raffle winner is awarded the 6-foot frog. Everyone laughs at the gag. Now, this is called a third-party purchase, a purchase that is made with money that's not yours. Therefore, you don't care about the cost. To buy something you're not going to consume. Therefore, you don't care about the quality. Here's the point. By definition, all government purchases are third-party purchases. The government spends other people's money on things it won't consume. It doesn't care about the price or the quality. Thus, there will always be waste in government spending. That's why, to paraphrase Abraham Lincoln, government should do only those things that a man cannot do better for himself. If 300 million Americans were free to buy health insurance for themselves, just as they buy their own life and home and car insurance, then that little gecko on television would offer us health insurance with a little more coverage for a little less cost. And he wouldn't be the only one. Insurance companies and hospitals would be working night and day to get our business. Quality would go up, prices would go down. It's already happened with laser eye surgery. It used to cost $2,200 per eye. Now it can cost as low as $500 per eye. That's the way free enterprise competition works every time. But when the government gets involved, costs go up, waste and fraud go up, essential medical services are denied or unavailable. These are the hallmarks of government healthcare bureaucracies around the globe. The sooner we make health insurance a first-party purchase again, the sooner Americans will get the healthcare they want. Finally. I'm Bob McEwen for Prager University.
Once upon a time, every student of history, and that meant pretty much everyone with a high school education, knew this. The Democratic Party was the party of slavery and Jim Crow, and the Republican Party was the party of emancipation and racial integration. Democrats were the Confederacy, and Republicans were the Union. Jim Crow Democrats were dominant in the South, and socially tolerant Republicans were dominant in the North. But then, in the 1960s and 70s, everything supposedly flipped. Suddenly, the Republicans became the racists, and the Democrats became the champions of civil rights. Fabricated by left-leaning academic elites and journalists, the story went like this. Republicans couldn't win a national election by appealing to the better nature of the country. They could only win by appealing to the worst. Attributed to Richard Nixon, the media's all-purpose bad guy, this came to be known as the Southern Strategy. It was very simple. Win elections by winning the South. And to win the South, appeal to racists. So the Republicans, the party of Lincoln, were to now be labeled the party of rednecks. But this story of the two parties switching identities is a myth. In fact, it's three myths wrapped into one false narrative. Let's take a brief look at each myth in turn. Myth number one, in order to be competitive in the South, Republicans started to pander to white racists in the 1960s. Fact, Republicans actually became competitive in the South as early as 1928 when Republican Herbert Hoover won over 47% of the South's popular vote against Democrat Al Smith. In 1952, Republican President Dwight Eisenhower won the southern states of Tennessee, Florida, and Virginia. And in 1956, he picked up Louisiana, Kentucky, and West Virginia too. And that was after he supported the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education that desegregated public schools, and after he sent the 101st Airborne to Little Rock Central High School to enforce integration. Myth number two, Southern Democrats, angry with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, switched parties. Fact, of the 21 Democratic senators who opposed the Civil Rights Act, just one became a Republican. The other 20 continued to be elected as Democrats or were replaced by other Democrats. On average, those 20 seats didn't go Republican for another 2.5 decades. Myth number three, since the implementation of the Southern Strategy, the Republicans have dominated the South. Fact, Richard Nixon, the man who is often credited with creating the Southern Strategy, lost the Deep South in 1968. In contrast, Democrat Jimmy Carter nearly swept the region in 1976, 12 years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And in 1992, over 28 years later, Democrat Bill Clinton won Georgia, Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia. The truth is, Republicans didn't hold a majority of Southern congressional seats until 1994, 30 years after the Civil Rights Act. As Kevin Williamson of National Review writes, if Southern rednecks ditched the Democrats because of a civil rights law passed in 1964, It is strange that they waited until the late 1980s and early 1990s to do so. They say things move slower in the South, but not that slow. So what really happened? Why does the South now vote overwhelmingly Republican? Because the South itself has changed. Its values have changed. The racism that once defined it doesn't anymore. Its values today are conservative ones, pro-life, pro-gun, and pro-small government. And here's the proof. Southern whites are far more likely to vote for a black conservative like Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina than a white liberal. In short, history has moved on. Like other regions of the country, the South votes values, not skin color. The myth of the Southern strategy is just the Democrats' excuse for losing the South, and yet another way to smear Republicans with the label racist. Don't buy it. I'm Carol Swain, professor of political science and law at Vanderbilt University for Prager University.
Progressive politicians love to talk about raising the minimum wage. It makes them sound caring, compassionate, concerned. They're on the side of the worker standing against the greedy employer. The current call is for a national $15 an hour minimum wage, more than double the current federal rate of $7.25. A number of cities and states are already there, including New York, California, Washington, D.C., and Seattle. Others are considering it. The left casts the minimum wage debate as a war between employee and employer. But most business owners pay their workers as much as they can. Finding and keeping good people is the hardest part of any employer's job. I know. For 17 years, I ran CKE Restaurants, the parent company of Carl's Jr. and Hardee's. Our company and franchise restaurants employed over 75,000 people. But as with most retail businesses, our profit margins were razor thin. Based on my experience, if we adopt the national minimum wage of $15, here's what will happen. 1, a lot of people will lose their jobs or have their hours reduced. According to a 2014 Congressional Budget Office study, just a $10 minimum wage would cost 500,000 jobs as businesses terminate employees. Obviously, far more jobs would be lost at $15 an hour. To survive, employers would have to reduce hours, even for workers who manage to keep their jobs. That's a pay cut. 2, businesses will close, and the jobs they created will disappear. A recent report from researchers at the Harvard Business School found that each $1 increase in the minimum wage results in a 4 to 10% increase in the likelihood of restaurants closing. An over $7 an hour increase to $15 would be devastating, not only for restaurants, but for small businesses and their employees. 3, young people will lose that entry-level job opportunity. My first job was scooping ice cream at a Baskin-Robbins in Cleveland, Ohio in the 1960s. Now, it paid just $1 an hour, but it taught me valuable lessons like the importance of showing up on time, teamwork, and presenting a happy demeanor to customers. No one can get that better job until they have their first job. 4, the cost of all workers will have to go up. If you hire a dishwasher at $15 an hour, your cooks will be unhappy with their wages. You're going to have to pay everybody more, which increases labor costs across the board. That's more pressure on profits. Too much pressure and you're out of business. 5, fewer people will open businesses. $15 an hour is a very steep hill to climb. Would-be entrepreneurs will do the math on labor costs and realize it's just not worth the risk. This is a real cost to the economy that we can't measure. A company that never exists never employs anyone. 6, prices for everything will go up as businesses pass higher labor costs along to consumers. One of 2 things will happen. Either consumers won't pay the higher prices and businesses will lay off workers or close, or consumers will pay higher prices and have less money to spend elsewhere. Either way, the higher minimum wage will represent a drag on the overall economy. Now, this may sound like doom and gloom, but it's already a reality for many business owners and workers in the cities and states that are raising the minimum wage. In San Francisco, AQ, a 2012 James Beard Award finalist for the best new restaurant in America, saw rising labor costs drive its profit margins down from 8.5% in 2012 to 1.5% by 2015. So it shut the doors. Jeremy Marin's chain of Cuban restaurants in New York closed 2 locations because of minimum wage increases and has raised prices at the restaurants he's still operating. The minimum wage, he said, is going up too fast. We can't catch our breath. Kevin McNamee is a chiropractor in California. I'll be moving my 2 companies out of Los Angeles, he wrote in a letter to the New York Times. When the city compels me to pay employees $15 an hour, it comes out of my pocket. Last year, my employees made more than I did. Now, these stories are already all too common. Expect them to become more so as cities and states pile on the $15 minimum wage bandwagon. So, if a $15 minimum wage doesn't help workers and doesn't help employers, who exactly does it help? Well, maybe just the progressive politicians who manage to mislead voters into believing that it's the right thing to do. Sounding caring, compassionate, and concerned is all well and good, but having a job is better. I'm Andy Puzder for Prager University.
The next time you hear someone complain about capitalism, consider this. The percentage of people living at starvation-level poverty has fallen 80% since 1970. Before then, more than 1 in 4 people around the world were living on $1 a day or less. Today, it's about 1 in 20. This is the greatest anti-poverty achievement in world history. So, how did this remarkable transformation come to pass? Was it the fabulous success of the United Nations? The generosity of U.S. foreign aid? The brilliant policies of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank? Stimulus spending? Government redistribution? No, it was none of those things. It was capitalism. Billions of souls around the world have been able to pull themselves out of poverty thanks to 5 incredible innovations: globalization, free trade, property rights, the rule of law, and entrepreneurship. Globalization means the ever-increasing ability to move goods, people, and ideas from one distant location to another. Free trade is open access to markets and people from all over the world with few, if any, barriers. Property rights is ensuring that what belongs to you can't be taken away on a whim by the state. The rule of law safeguards contracts, assuring that they will be respected and lived up to whether the deal is made in Peru or Poland. And entrepreneurship is the creativity of free people to dream up new products that we never knew we wanted or needed. It's worth noting that in places like East Asia, these 5 things were all made possible by the historic peace after World War II that resulted from America's global diplomatic and military presence. Let me put this in a slightly different way. The ideals of free enterprise and global leadership, central to capitalism and American conservatism, are responsible for the greatest reduction in human misery since mankind began its long climb from the swamp to the stars. This remarkable progress has been America's gift to the world. So, if these American conservative ideals have done so much to lift up the world's poor, you'd think conservative ideas would be gaining strength every single day, everywhere. And not just gaining strength among conservatives, but also among young idealists, immigrants, minorities, and advocates for the poor, all embracing the principles of free enterprise and unleashing its power on behalf of the vulnerable. But this hasn't happened. To the contrary, capitalism is struggling to attract new followers. Indeed, some believe it's destined to fade away, just as it has in much of Europe. According to a Harvard study, only 42% of young Americans 18 to 29 have a favorable view of capitalism. What explains this discrepancy between the incredible results of capitalism and its popularity? Why does capitalism get such a bad rap? One answer is simple. The defenders of free enterprise have done a terrible job of telling people how much good the system has done around the world. Capitalism has saved a couple billion people, and we have treated this miracle like a state secret. According to a 2013 survey, 84% of Americans are unaware of the progress made against poverty worldwide. Indeed, more than 2/3 think global hunger has actually gotten worse. This ignorance has consequences because there's no substitute for capitalism in the 5 innovations that make it work. Years of economic research tell us no other system comes close. Certainly not communism, not even socialism. You need a system that works while you sleep. One that creates the foundations of human prosperity without central planning or benevolent bureaucrats. More capitalism, more growth. The formula might seem deceptively simple, but it works. So how do we lift up the next billion? The answer should be clear. If you really want to help the poor, stand up for capitalism. I'm Arthur Brooks, President of the American Enterprise Institute for Prager University.
Over the last 400 years, what power has done the most to spread the ideals of limited government, an independent judiciary, certain inalienable rights, and free markets? That power would be the British Empire. It was Britain that gave these ideals to the United States. It was the British Empire, the largest empire the world has ever known, which made these ideals global aspirations. It was the British Empire, along with America, that defended these ideals in 2 colossal world wars. Freedom was an Englishman's right, and wherever he went, he took that right with him, whether he was an English colonist in America, governing himself through a locally elected assembly, or an English adventurer like Sir Stamford Raffles, creating the free market city-state of Singapore, or an English officer like T.E. Lawrence, leading Arab tribesmen against the Turks. The British always thought of themselves as liberators, as bringers of freedom. The British believed the final and necessary justification of their empire was a moral one. The British kept the peace. They brought sound, honest administration. And they insisted that basic moral standards were honored. The British did not try to nation build in the way we think of it now. They were under no illusions about making Arabs or Afghans or Zulus into Englishmen. They were more than content to leave people alone, to let them be themselves, to govern them with the lightest possible hand. In American history, we remember this when we think of the British Empire's so-called benign neglect. We can see it throughout the history of the British Empire. Think about the vast territory of the Sudan. It was governed by 140 British civil servants. Even Gandhi praised the British Empire, paraphrasing Jefferson, saying that he believed that the best government was the government that governed least, and that he found that the British Empire guaranteed his freedom and governed him least of all. In the defense of freedom, the empire drew moral lines. No power did more to abolish slavery and the slave trade in the modern world than did the British Empire. The British Treasury spent enormous sums to liberate slaves and compensate slave owners in the Caribbean. The Royal Navy had as a primary duty the eradication of the slave trade, and in fact, abolishing the slave trade became a major factor driving the expansion of the British Empire. The British enforced a Pax Britannica, putting down pirates, taming headhunters, and keeping the peace between previously warring tribes and religions. While respecting and often ruling through local leaders, the British still insisted on certain Judeo-Christian moral standards. They were not, in that respect, multiculturalists. They had a firm sense of right and wrong. When Sir Charles Napier was confronted by the practice of suttee, widow burning, in India, he told the Brahmin priests involved that he understood it was their custom. But the British had a custom too. They hanged men who burned women alive, and their goods were confiscated. So if the Brahmins insisted on continuing their tradition of widow burning, then he would insist on following his British tradition of hanging the murderers of widows. Widow burning in India soon ceased. But we don't have to dig far into history, into the abolition of slavery and widow burning, to find the British Empire on the side of moral right and freedom. We can think of events within our own lifetimes or those of our parents and grandparents. When we think of the 2 deadliest threats to freedom in the 20th century, we generally think of communism and Nazism. But how many remember that in 1940, after the Hitler-Stalin Pact and after the fall of France, one power, the British Empire, stood alone in mortal combat against the combined tyrannies of the world? Even where the British have merited criticism, as in Ireland, there is more to the imperial story. During negotiations to create the Irish Republic, for instance, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who could speak Welsh, reminded the Irish nationalist and Gaelic extremist Eamon de Valera that the Celts never had a word for republic. It was an idea given to them by the English. This is our own history, too. If you love America, you should also love the power that gave us our sense of inalienable rights, rights traceable back to Magna Carta. It all started in America with the British Empire, a great liberty-loving empire. It is the empire's legacy, the English-speaking world, that remains the great global guardian of freedom today. I'm H.W. Crocker for Prager University.
I have no self-esteem. I'm not saying I dislike myself or that I have a problem with my self-image, and I don't have low self-esteem. I'm just saying that I have no self-esteem at all. Why? For the same reason that I have no pet unicorns. Self-esteem is a fantasy. It's a meaningless fabrication that exists only in your imagination. The dictionary defines esteem this way: to regard with admiration. Self-esteem, therefore, means to regard yourself with admiration. But is that how we should see ourselves? If someone asked you who you admire, would you really want to answer, well, I admire myself? Would that be a good thing? I would say no, emphatically. I was hardly a precocious kid, but I think I realized this self-esteem thing was a racket as far back as junior high. I remember when the guidance counselor at my school handed out a worksheet and asked us to rate our self-esteem on a scale of 1 to 10. Meanwhile, kids in China were learning silly things like math and science. Now we're bankrupt and they own the country, but at least we all feel pretty good about ourselves. In any case, there we were, facing the important task of arbitrarily quantifying our egos. When I asked my teacher why I should have high self-esteem, she said, because you're special. When I asked why I was special, she said, because you're you. I found this an odd statement at the time, coming as it was from the woman who had just given me a D on my last math quiz. Most of my classmates, though, quickly jotted down 9s and 10s. Incidentally, some of them would grow up to become unemployed alcoholics, but I'm guessing if they could take that test again, they'd score themselves exactly the same. See, that's the whole point of self-esteem, to be proud of yourself even when there's no reason to be proud of yourself. Of course, apologists will claim that self-esteem is simply about confidence, and that you need confidence to succeed in life. Okay, but if self-esteem is simply about confidence, then why don't we just call it confidence? Because confidence must be earned. A student is confident about doing well on a test if he studies for it. An athlete is confident on the field if he practices. A singer is confident in her abilities if she, in fact, has abilities. Self-esteem, on the other hand, can be defined as unearned confidence. The person with high self-esteem, also known as a narcissist, feels good about himself on the basis of nothing. We may ask him, why do you esteem yourself? And his learned response will be, because I'm me. Like a modern-day Narcissus, he can't see the world outside the window because he's too busy whispering sweet nothings to his reflection in the glass. In a saner, less confused time, people saw it the opposite way. It didn't matter how you felt about yourself, it mattered what you did. Funny, that's what my parents taught me. I remember one time explaining very carefully to my dad that he couldn't expect me to do my math assignment because math made me feel bad about myself. In return, he suggested that maybe I should study more, and then math wouldn't make me feel so bad. But in the meantime, he said, it doesn't matter how you feel. Do your homework. Doesn't matter how I feel? What a scandalous notion. I probably should have called social services. If this self-esteem thing was just another benign form of entertainment, we could just laugh it off. But it's become a serious problem because this I'm special, love yourself, you get points for breathing dogma taints everything it touches. It equips you for nothing. It won't help you at school. it will stifle your career ambitions, and it will certainly wreak havoc on your relationships. Sure, insecurity and self-doubt can also be defeating, but at least there's a chance that they might drive you to be better. Self-esteem actually prevents improvement because you can only improve if you first acknowledge what you're not good at. But that process might take a toll on your self-esteem, so many people avoid it. I'm not saying that you should hate yourself, and I'm not saying that you should have low self-esteem. I'm saying have no self-esteem, as in stop thinking about it, period. Do good things with your life, and you'll have all the esteem you'll ever need. I'm Matt Walsh for Prager University.
Do you think the United States and Western Europe are made up of imperialist, colonialist, resource-exploiting, greedy, grasping, brown-skin-hating people whose values are not worth defending? If you think this question is absurd and that no one thinks this way, you would be very much mistaken. Many people do. And what's even more disturbing, many of these people were born and live in the West. In other words, they've come to despise their own culture. This thinking is the product of a doctrine widely taught in our schools. It's known as multiculturalism, the belief that all cultures are equal. Or to put it another way, no culture's values, art, music, political system, or literature are better or worse than any other. But is this really true? Some years ago, Nobel Prize-winning novelist Saul Bellow created a major controversy when he said, "Find me the Tolstoy of the Zulus or the Proust of the Papuans, and I would be happy to read him." For this, Bellow was accused of racism. The charge was nonsense. Bellow wasn't saying that the Zulus and Papuans are incapable of producing great novelists. He was saying that as far as he knew, they hadn't. But just by raising the possibility that some cultures have contributed more than others, he violated the chief tenet of multiculturalism. More recently, President Donald Trump expressed a similar sentiment in Warsaw, Poland. We write symphonies, we pursue innovation, we treasure the rule of law and protect the right to free speech and free expression. We empower women as pillars of our society and of our success. That is who we are. Those are the priceless ties that bind us together as a civilization. For this, Trump was roundly condemned by the multiculturalists. How could he say these things, one writer wrote, as if these were unique qualities to white-dominated nations instead of universal truths of the human race across all cultures? Here's the problem. Are values such as innovation, rule of law, free expression, and women's empowerment equally held across all cultures? If all cultures are equal, how does one account for the fact that for the past 500 years, it has been one culture, the culture of the West, and now of America, that has shaped the world? Multiculturalists explain it in terms of oppression. Western civilization, they say, became so powerful because it is so evil. The study of Western civilization, they insist, should focus on colonialism and slavery, the unique mechanisms of Western oppression. But colonialism and slavery are not uniquely Western at all. They are universal. The British conquered India and ruled it for 300 years. But before the British, the Persians, the Mongols, the Muslims, and Alexander the Great had done exactly the same thing, conquered large parts of India. Indeed, the British were the 6th or 7th colonial invader to occupy India. As for slavery, it has existed in every culture. It was prevalent in ancient China, in ancient India, in Greece and Rome, and in Africa. American Indians practiced slavery long before Columbus set foot here. What is uniquely Western, in fact, is not slavery, but the abolition of slavery. And what distinguishes the West from all other cultures are the institutions of democracy, capitalism, and science. These institutions developed because of a peculiar dynamism of Athens and Jerusalem, a synthesis of classical reason and Judeo-Christian morality. And it is these institutions, I believe, that comprise the source of Western strength and explain the West's long-standing dominance in the world. The West's greatest strength is not merely its military power, but also the unparalleled power of its ideas and institutions. But what about America? If America is a nation of immigrants, mostly non-white immigrants, doesn't that by definition make it a multicultural society? No. America is a multi-ethnic society. We don't want it to be a multicultural society. I'm an immigrant from India. My wife is an immigrant from Venezuela. Despite our differences of ethnic background, we have both assimilated to the unique values of America, the values embodied in our Constitution and our laws, the pursuit of happiness, the American dream. So, no, the United States and Western Europe are not made up of imperialist, colonialist, resource-exploiting, greedy, grasping, brown-skin-hating people. Our values are worth defending, not just because they are ours, but because they are good. I'm Dinesh D'Souza for Prager University.
Countless books, seminars, and gurus promise to teach you the secrets to success. Well, here's my secret. There are no secrets to success. Actually, it's pretty simple. Want to excel in whatever you do? Get to work. Keep working, and don't stop until the job is done. That's called work ethic. I'm the sideline reporter for NBC's Sunday Night Football. I won't lie, it's a dream job. But it isn't a dream come true. There's no fantasy involved, just a lifetime of hard work. I had my first real job at 13. I was a paper girl. I delivered newspapers to people's homes and sold subscriptions door to door. That job taught me persistence. I learned that to succeed, especially in sales, you have to knock on a lot of doors. In high school, I worked at Baskin-Robbins. The manager didn't appreciate it when I gave out overly generous portions to customers. That taught me accountability. Until you run the show, you answer to the person who does. A few years later, I worked as a telemarketer for an insurance company. A lot of people look down on telemarketers. I don't. If you think a legitimate job is beneath you, you don't deserve that job, or any other. Like all telemarketers, I was rejected far more often than not. Usually I didn't get past the first sentence, but sometimes I did, enough to make some good money. The path to success is paved with failure. As a waitress in college, I learned that you need to smile and treat customers well even when you're having a bad day. Leave your mood at the door or expect to be shown the door. After I graduated, I had 7 jobs. Count them, 7. One of those was a public relations assistant in Los Angeles. It was fun, but it involved ridiculously long hours. That was okay, though. I got used to it. And when long hours were called for later, I was ready. I went from PR to producing a morning radio show. The host had talent, we put out a good product, but it wasn't enough because timing and luck are also important, and you can't control those. You can only control what you do. You just have to keep working. What choice do you have? The radio show gave me the idea that I could be a host, the talent. I put together a demo and sent it out to every station I could find an address for. I finally caught the eye of a sports show in Charlotte, North Carolina. I decided that I would never think of myself as a female sports reporter, but just as a sports reporter. My ambition is to be the best sports journalist, period. What does being a woman have to do with it? As the newbie, I was at the station all day and took every assignment that I could, especially the ones no one else wanted. After 5 months, TV stations noticed I was scooping their stories and started calling. One of those was CBS Sports. I took that job. It was a huge jump, and it put me under a microscope. I wasn't used to that. I made a lot of mistakes, some honest ones and some really dumb ones. All of them were public. My bosses didn't hold back their displeasure, and neither did the viewers. This pushed me to screw up less and taught me how to deal with criticism. Mistakes are life's way of highlighting what you need to improve. So I kept making mistakes, and I kept improving. After 5 years, I was offered a job at ESPN. After 10 years there, I joined NBC, where I am now. After all of that, a lifetime of work, I think I've learned what it takes to succeed. Whether it's your first job or your dream job, the formula is always the same. Get to work. Keep working. And don't stop until the job is done. That's the secret that's not a secret to success. I'm Michelle Tafoya for Prager University.
It's now okay for a man to hit a woman. That, in effect, is what a mixed martial arts league decided when it allowed Fallon Fox, a biological male, to fight as a woman simply because he identifies as one. And the consequence of this decision? Fox sent female fighter Tamika Brents to the hospital with a broken skull and a concussion. Brents needed 7 surgical staples to bind her wounds. The battered woman, a trained fighter herself, said of her match with Fox, "I've never felt so overpowered in my life." 20 years ago, if a man hit a woman so hard that he sent her to the hospital, he'd be in prison. Now, he can get paid for it. Today we are told that male and female are one and the same. This denial of male-female differences has led to the astonishing belief that men and women are not born male or female. They are whatever gender they say they are. Facebook went so far as to offer its users over 50 genders to choose from. Know what a demi-boy is? Me neither. The idea that gender identification is now a personal choice might sound enlightened to some, but it's actually a very anti-scientific view of one of the essential facts of life. Men and women are inherently different. Their brains are different, their hormones are different, their chromosomes are different, and of course, their bodies are different. No amount of peer-reviewed papers from gender studies departments can change this. But that won't stop the progressive elites who run our universities, news media, many of our biggest companies, and even our high schools and elementary schools from trying. For their efforts, women will pay an especially high price. That's because the men and women are the same argument invariably leads women to be judged against a male standard. Or to put it another way, to be more of a woman has to be more like a man. She has to want to have casual sex like a man, to serve in combat like a man, to pursue a career with single-minded intensity like a man. Of course, there are exceptions, but the overwhelming majority of women aren't seeking casual sex, don't have the physical strength of men, and don't share the same work-life priorities as men. Ironically, this quest for sameness is occurring at a time when science is telling us more emphatically than ever that we are different. So what your grandmother took for granted, men and women are different, science now confirms. But there is no room for science in, say, stores like Target or Toys R Us, where toys are no longer divided into the boys section and the girls section, or in a North Carolina school district where students can no longer be called boys and girls, but only students, or in college dorms where co-ed bathrooms and even co-ed bedrooms are increasingly common. For the tiny percentage of people who experience gender dysphoria, we should have nothing but compassion. We should do everything we can to help them and protect their dignity. But we don't need to overturn biologically defined sex differences to do so. But that's what's happening. Using the wrong pronoun at the office might get you fired. In Canada, it might land you in court. In mixed martial arts, as we have seen, it can lead to getting your head bashed in. Apparently, this is a small price to pay in a world where we must all genuflect to political correctness. Even after being hospitalized, Tamika Brents knew she had to toe the PC line. When asked how she explained why she lost so badly to a man who said he was a woman, she said, "I can't answer whether it's because she was born a man or not, because I'm not a doctor." Vice magazine, writing about the incident, had no sympathy for Brents. Why should they? As they wrote, biological sex isn't black and white. But in virtually every instance, it is. The longer we allow the obvious to go unstated and undefended, the worse it will be, for boys and girls, and for men and women, but especially for women. The sexes are different. Rather than trying to quash this reality, which can only lead to more needless confusion and suffering, not less, we should step back and marvel at it, and enjoy it. Male-female differences are among the most wonderful things in life. I'm Ashley McGuire for Prager University.
Did President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal economic policies pull the country out of the Great Depression? My research clearly suggests that the answer, contrary to popular belief, is no. In fact, the New Deal made matters worse. Let me explain. The centerpiece of Roosevelt's New Deal plan to fix the economy was the National Industrial Recovery Act, or NIRA, which the president announced with great fanfare in June of 1933. FDR believed that he could use the government to artificially raise both prices and wages. It would work like this. Higher prices would raise profits. That makes business happy, And higher wages would raise income. That makes workers happy. More profits for business mean more money to hire new workers. Higher wages for workers means more money to buy consumer goods. A virtuous cycle is set in motion, and the economy improves rapidly. But here's what FDR missed. Artificially raising wages also raises labor costs. And when labor costs go up, business hires fewer workers or no workers at all, especially in a difficult economic environment. Meanwhile, artificially raising prices reduces demand for the obvious reason that people buy less of something when its price goes higher. So why did FDR do this? FDR based his New Deal policy largely on what happened during World War I, which had ended only 15 years earlier in 1918. During that war, the government established planning boards to set wages and prices, and economic activity increased. If it worked during wartime, FDR reasoned, it should work during peacetime. But Roosevelt confused the increase in economic activity that was actually the result of inflated war demands as being due to government planning. The government, Roosevelt concluded, could much better manage the economy in a time of crisis than private enterprise, which in his worldview only considered its own selfish interests. Therefore, government guidance, not free enterprise, was the citizen's steadfast ally. Contrary to what you might think, big business, including autos and steel, were happy to go along with FDR's plan, at least at first. If the government was going to ensure their profits, who were they to complain? So instead of prohibiting monopolies, something the government is actually supposed to do, the NIRA created monopolies on the condition that these favored industries immediately raised wages significantly and bargained collectively with labor. Not surprisingly, the Supreme Court declared the NIRA unconstitutional in May 1935, stating that FDR violated constitutional separation of powers. He had meddled in an area, private business, where he had no constitutional right. But the decision had little practical effect because the government simply ignored it. Meanwhile, the wage side of the equation rose faster than expected because of the passage of another New Deal law, the 1935 Wagner Act. The Wagner Act provided unions with new collective bargaining rights, and as the labor unions grew in size and power, so did workers' wages. The result was that between 1933 and 1939, these government policies, the NIRA and the Wagner Act, increased prices and wages by about 20%. These artificial price and wage increases impeded what should have been a strong recovery from the Depression. They prevented the natural forces of competition from pushing prices down and pushing worker productivity up. Instead, artificially high wages led industry to hire fewer workers, and high prices reduced demand for products. If these policies had not been adopted, my research, as well as research by other economists, indicates the economy would have returned to its normal level of employment and output by 1936. In other words, the policies that were supposed to restore prosperity actually prolonged the Depression. I'm Lee Ohanian, professor of economics at UCLA for Prager University.
Do you want equality between men and women? I do, which is why I own a gun. My Glock 43 is my equalizer. Too NRA for you? Then let's take a step back and think about this. I will start with this premise. Men are physically stronger than women. I know, even this is controversial these days, but men have more muscle mass and greater bone density. They run faster and punch harder. It's called biology. If a woman is going to protect herself against a man who intends to do her serious harm, she needs to even the odds. And what's the best way for her to do that? Own a gun and know how to use it. Given this, you would think that feminists would be lining up in front of gun shops, spending quality time at the shooting range, and filing for concealed carry permits. But when was the last time you heard a feminist speak out for women owning guns? You haven't, because feminists aren't for gun ownership, they're for taking guns away from women. Well, you might say, if no one owned a gun, then everybody would be safer. Yes, and it would be nice if cheesecake was a diet food. There are over 300 million guns in the United States, and that's not going to change anytime soon. But even if we could build a giant magnet, fly it across the country, and snap up every gun, it wouldn't much matter to women's safety. In Great Britain, where it's almost impossible to get a gun, a woman is 3 times more likely to be raped than in America, according to a study by David Kopel, a professor of constitutional law at Denver University. Here's another telling comparison between gun-free UK and gun-owning US. In the United States, only about 13% of home burglaries take place when the occupants are home. But in the UK, almost 60% do. Professor Kopel explains the disparity. American burglars avoid occupied homes because of the risk of getting shot. English burglars prefer occupied homes because there will be wallets and purses with cash. And by the way, an assailant doesn't need a gun to be dangerous. What do you do if you're a woman and a man comes at you with a knife, or just his bare hands? If you want to depend on pepper spray or a whistle, okay. But I think your finger on the trigger of a gun would be more effective. Take the example of mail carrier Catherine Latta. After she had been assaulted and raped by her ex-boyfriend, Latta tried to purchase a firearm. She was told it might take a month to get a permit. "I'll be dead by then," she recalls telling the clerk. That afternoon, she went to a rough part of town and bought a handgun. 5 hours later, her ex-boyfriend attacked her outside of her home. She shot him in self-defense and saved her life. I should add that firing a gun is very rare. Just carrying it, let alone brandishing it, is a deterrent. And isn't that the issue? Personal safety? How is a woman supposed to defend herself? What if an intruder breaks into her home? Liberal TV personality Sherri Shepherd answered this question a few years ago. At 1 a.m, the alarm in our house went off, Shepherd told her co-hosts on the popular daytime show, The View. As the alarm blared, her husband, Sal, went downstairs to look around. If something happened to him, a terrified Shepherd realized she had no way to protect herself or her son, Jeffrey. All I had was this wicker basket. I don't have a bat, nothing. We're going to get a gun, I told Sal. This just made me realize how vulnerable you are if you can't protect your home. And the police were wonderful. They came about 7 minutes later. But to me, that's 7 minutes too late. Luckily for Shepherd, the incident was a false alarm. But there are lots of cases where the alarm is real, especially in high-crime areas. Yet every year, progressives push for more and more gun control without ever considering who will pay the price. It won't be the bad guys. They always get the guns they want. It will be the good women who need to equal the odds in a dangerous confrontation with a man. Women owning guns shouldn't be a partisan issue. In fact, it's a women's rights issue. I'm all for equality between the sexes, and I practice what I preach. That's why I own a gun. I'm Katie Pavlich for Prager University.
Everyone knows the earlier you learn a language, the easier it is to master. Learning a foreign language at 4 takes a lot less effort than learning one at 40. The same holds true with managing your money. I can tell you this from personal experience. I grew up in a home where the value of money was a frequent topic of conversation. Today, I teach people how to get out of debt and build wealth with my dad, Dave Ramsey. Growing up in my parents' home, I learned a few things about kids and money. Here are 3. 1, put your kids to work. It's very important that your kids understand that money comes from work, not from mom and dad's wallets. As soon as your children can grasp the concept of cause and effect, and that happens at a very young age, you can start teaching them about the work-money connection. Have them clean the playroom, take out the trash, put away their laundry. There are a million things they can do. Just make sure it's age-appropriate. Don't have your 5-year-old mow the lawn. And pay them for some of the work they do. Let your kids know that in the real world, you get paid only when you work. And it's with the money made from work that you can buy the things you want. When children work for things they want to buy, the purchase feels like an accomplishment, not an entitlement. You're sending the opposite message when you just hand your kids a $20 bill when they ask for it, or give them an allowance for essentially breathing. Of course, not everything your child decides to buy will be a smart purchase. And that brings us to lesson number 2. Let your kids make mistakes with their money. Many adults make expensive mistakes because as kids, they were never allowed to make small, inexpensive ones. Tears now will save a lot of tears later. When I was young, my parents took our family to Opryland Theme Park in Nashville. Dad and Mom had one simple rule. If you want to play the carnival games, you have to spend your own money. Of course, I ran to the first game near the entrance, slapped some cash on the table, and took my turn. I lost. So I put down more money, and I lost again and again. And then came the terrible moment when I reached into my pocket and found nothing but lint. We had a whole day at Opryland ahead of us, and I had blown through my cash. I ran back to Mom and Dad and begged them for more money and promised I'd pay them back. What Dad said has stuck with me ever since. Rachel, when the money's gone, it's gone. Your children are going to make some dumb choices. They'll waste money on stuff that a week later they wish they had never bought. And as their parent, there are times you need to let them make that mistake and suffer the consequences. That's how they learn. Lesson number 3, teach your kids to make saving a habit. Saving money is a discipline. How many adults do you know who save on a regular, consistent basis? But here's a fundamental financial truth. If you don't save money, you won't have money. Teach your children that saving is one of the first things you do when you get paid, not what you do with money you have left over. Fast forward 20 years. If they haven't learned to save, they're likely to go into debt for the things they want or need. Once they start down that road, it's very unlikely that they'll build wealth because their paycheck will be going to debt payments instead of investing for the future. I encourage parents to teach their children to save some of the money they earn. The habit of saving money is what's important here, not the exact dollar amount. The amount they save will depend on what they're saving to buy. And better for them to learn how to save now when Mom and Dad are supporting them. Or Mom and Dad, that's you, will be supporting them a lot longer than planned. So start today. Help your kids become fluent in the language of money and how to handle it. Because if you don't, well, all I can say is get the basement ready. I'm Rachel Cruz for Prager University.
Trust in the media is at an all-time low, and for good reason. We in the business of journalism have exempted ourselves from the normal rules that used to govern us, and so the most egregious kinds of reporting errors are becoming more common. Formerly well-respected news organizations and experienced national reporters are making the sorts of mistakes that wouldn't be tolerated in journalism school. When these mistakes are corrected at all, it's with seemingly little regret. And the corrections never get anywhere near as much attention as the original salacious but incorrect narrative. How do we get here? I discuss that in detail in my book, The Smear. Here are 3 factors. First, firewalls that once strictly separated news from opinion have been replaced by hopelessly blurred lines. Once forbidden practices such as editorializing within straight news reports and the inclusion of opinions as if fact are not only tolerated, they're encouraged. The result, it's never been harder for Americans to separate news that's real from news that's not. Example, May 14, 2016, 10 days after Donald Trump became the Republican presidential nominee, the New York Times published a blockbuster article titled "Crossing the Line: How Donald Trump Behaved with Women in Private." The story's authors, Michael Barbaro and Megan Twohey, interviewed Roanne Lane, an ex-girlfriend of Trump's. Her quotes made Trump sound at best like a jerk and at worst like a predator. The reporters went so far as to provide their own quotes for the story, presenting their personal commentary as if it were established fact, writing, "This is the public treatment of some women by Mr. Trump, degrading, impersonal, performed." The problem is the reporting wasn't true, according to Trump's supposed victim. Once the story was published, she publicly accused the Times of misleading her, writing a hit piece against Trump, and putting a negative connotation on what she said was not a negative experience. No matter where you stand, this was a huge development in terms of journalism. the main source behind front-page national news, discredited the entire premise of the story. You'd expect something like that to rock the whole news organization and prompt investigations, a retraction, and re-examination of policies. Yet I can find no record of any of that. The Times and their reporters never even apologized or printed a correction. Second, though we may personally like or dislike a politician, as journalists we're obligated to treat them the same. Too often, that's not the case. For example, in May 2008, then presidential candidate Barack Obama said he had visited 57 states. Since there are only 50 states, everyone knew what he meant. He meant to say that he had visited 47 states. The remark, nothing more than a verbal gaffe, drew little attention, and it didn't deserve more. But when Sarah Palin made a comparable gaffe saying, "We've got to stand with our North Korean allies," she was relentlessly ridiculed and mocked in the media, even though everyone knew she meant to say South Korean allies. Third, too many of us have allowed ourselves to become tools of politicians and spinmeisters, often in order to get something in return. I call this transactional journalism. Example, emails show in July 2009, the Atlantic reporter Mark Ambinder was promised a scoop. He'd get an advanced copy of a speech by then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, but only if he followed certain conditions, as privately dictated by Clinton aide Philippe Rines. Rines emailed Ambinder precise instructions, including, "Describe Clinton's voice as muscular," and "Don't say you were blackmailed," by which Clinton aide Rines obviously meant, "Don't reveal our arrangement." "Got it," replied Ambinder. His resulting article reads in part, "When you think of President Obama's foreign policy, think of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. That's the message behind a muscular speech that Clinton is set to deliver today." That Ambinder, then considered a serious journalist, would allegedly violate basic ethics for such a minor story speaks volumes about the state of today's news media. For the record, Ambinder defended himself by saying that he found Clinton's speech to be muscular, so the adjective was appropriate. I think most Americans would like to believe their news is factual, well-researched, and untainted by a reporter's opinion. To put it another way, they want their news straight up. But too often now, that's not what they're getting, and they know it. I'm frequently asked, can the news be fixed? The answer is yes. But the first step to fixing a problem is admitting that we have one. Until we do that, nothing can change. I'm Cheryl Atkinson for Prager University.
I used to be a senior software engineer at Google until they fired me for doing something unforgivable, something so controversial that it was the #1 news story for days. My crime? I wrote an internal document that, among other things, suggested that men and women, on average, are different. Like I told you, unforgivable. The politically progressive viewpoint, which is dominant at Google and in the media, is that all disparities in society are due to injustices, or in this case, that the gender gap in tech is solely due to some form of sexism. But is this true? The politically correct answer is yes, and Google acts accordingly. It treats men and women differently during hiring and promotion, holds official women-only events, and gives mandatory sensitivity training on how to combat alleged sexist bias. Of course, all of this makes sense if sexism is indeed the sole cause of the imbalance. But what if men and women are not exactly the same? Then sexism is just one of many possible causes of the imbalance. And exclusionary programs and differential treatment can be a counterproductive form of sexism. These practices actually increase tensions and make some feel like Google cares more about their gender than their programming ability. As an engineer, when I'm faced with a problem, I want to solve it. So I decided to research the premise that men and women are exactly the same. I wrote my findings in a 10-page document titled Google's Ideological Echo Chamber. You can read it online. What did I discover? That not all of the male-female disparity in tech may be the result of sexism, that at least some of it may be attributed to men and women having different goals for their careers and their lives. To cite just 2 examples, in the study Women, Careers, and Work-Life Preferences, published in the British Journal of Guidance and Counseling, the study's authors conclude that women across populations tend to look for more work-life balance, while men tend to have a higher drive for status. And according to a study by Cal State Fullerton psychologist Richard Lippa, men, on average, tend to be more interested in things, while women tend to be more interested in people. These findings have been replicated many times. They've actually been cited by other researchers as a cause for the gender gap in tech. In other words, I didn't make this stuff up. In fact, after my document came under attack, evolutionary psychologist Jeffrey Miller said its empirical claims were scientifically accurate. But Google disagreed. Like, really disagreed. First, the company's newly appointed VP of Diversity, Integrity, and Governance, Danielle Brown, posted a memo that said my report advanced incorrect assumptions about gender. Google CEO Sundar Pichai sent a memo to all employees saying that I crossed the line by advancing harmful gender stereotypes. This was, he added, not okay. Then he fired me. By that point, much to my shock, my document had gone viral. News outlets were branding it an anti-diversity manifesto. But if they had read what I wrote, they could see for themselves that it was pro-diversity. I had suggested multiple ways that we could get more women into tech without resorting to counterproductive discrimination. Ironic, isn't it? The company that hires some of the smartest people in the world couldn't handle a well-reasoned scientific discussion. But my firing pales in comparison to the larger issue. Will Google force upon its users the same politically correct views that it forces upon its employees? The evidence is disturbing. Google already manipulates its products to fit a certain viewpoint. Just one example, YouTube, Google's video platform, restricts access to dozens of PragerU videos, along with videos made by other influential moderates and conservatives. Yes, Google is a business and can set its own policies, but for its billions of users, Google is their main gateway to information, the lens through which they view the world. This makes Google, in some ways, more powerful than even the government. And that means Google has a special responsibility to, well, simply follow its own motto, don't be evil. I'm James Damore for Prager University.
Food, football, and oppression. That's what Thanksgiving has come to mean to many Americans. Back in 2007, Seattle public school officials made national news by describing the holiday as a time of mourning and a bitter reminder of 500 years of betrayal. This new narrative describes the Pilgrims as arrogant oppressors who fled persecution only to become persecutors themselves, depriving Native Americans of their land and their lives. But this is wrong on every count. First of all, the Pilgrims didn't cross the ocean to flee persecution or even England. They'd been living for over a decade in Holland, Europe's most tolerant nation and a haven for religious dissenters. Free from interference by the Church of England, they feared seduction, not persecution, worrying that their children would be corrupted by the materialistic Dutch culture. That's why they risked their dangerous 1620 voyage to a wilderness continent, not because they were running from oppression, but because they were running toward holiness, fulfilling a fateful mission to build an ideal Christian commonwealth. They initially planned to plant this model society on the wild, wolf-infested island known to natives as Manhattan. But winds and tides blew them 250 miles off course, dumping the Mayflower on the frozen coast of Massachusetts. Somehow, the Pilgrims saw their dire situation as a demonstration of providential power, especially after a giant wave picked up the flimsy boat of a scouting party on a stormy December night. The turbulent sea then deposited them safely, miraculously, on a little island within sight of the ideal location for their settlement. It was a deserted Indian village with cleared land, stored supplies of corn, and a reliable source of fresh water. No, these supposedly cruel conquerors never actually invaded that village. Instead, they expressed a fervent desire to pay the natives for the dried corn they found, if only they could find someone to pay. But the former inhabitants had perished during 3 years of plague, probably smallpox, that immediately preceded the Pilgrims' arrival. One of the few survivors of that devastation turned up several months later to welcome the English newcomers. Against all odds, he proved to be the single human being on the continent best suited to help the struggling settlers, since he spoke English and had already embraced Christianity. His name was Squanto, and he had grown up in this very village before a ruthless sea captain kidnapped him as a boy and sold him into slavery in Spain. After 4 years, he was freed by kindly monks, then made his way to England, and finally sailed across the Atlantic, only to find his friends and family all wiped out by disease. Over the next few months, Squanto helped the English newcomers plant crops and negotiate a friendly trade agreement with the region's most important chief, Massasoit. No wonder Pilgrim leader William Bradford called Squanto a special instrument sent of God for their good. The celebration, later known as the First Thanksgiving, actually involved a 3-day harvest festival in October, apparently inspired by the biblical holiday of Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles. 90 hungry Indian warriors joined the 53 surviving pilgrims for this occasion. Nearly half of the colonists had died during the brutal winter. The Englishmen provided some vegetables, fish, and perhaps wild turkeys, while the natives brought 5 recently hunted deer as house gifts. The preferred sport on this occasion wasn't football, but shooting, with settlers and Indians sharing a fierce fascination with guns. Though these hardy pilgrims loom large in the American imagination, they never built their Plymouth settlement into a major colony. In nearby Boston, the later colony of Massachusetts Bay grew so much faster that it swallowed up the great-grandchildren of the Pilgrims in 1691. But the sense of purpose of the original Pilgrims left a permanent imprint on the national character. They maintained unshakable confidence that God protected them, not to grant special privileges, but to impose special responsibilities. They saw themselves as instruments, not authors, of a mysterious master plan. Today, with our continued blessings so obvious and so overwhelming, the only reason to treat this beloved national holiday as a time of mourning is that some foolish Americans actually think that's a good idea. The Pilgrims knew better. They understood that people of every culture and every era can gain more from gratitude than from guilt. I'm Michael Medved for Prager University.
Thank you for watching this video. To help keep PragerU videos free, please consider making a tax-deductible donation.